Hey, Shalom, welcome back. Esoteric Duvidism. More today. I'm trying to up the intellectual content of my channel and the discussions we're having. So in order to do that, I want to present some factual information. And this is specifically related to the debate I had with Jean-François on the public space about evolution. In that debate, I was specifically taking the negative of evolution. I wanted to show that it was logical to believe in the soul and God. But for the sake of that debate, I was only trying to demonstrate that evolution was not as solid a theory as a lot of people think it is. There's a lot of holes in it. Evolution can't explain consciousness. Very weak evidence that evolution could explain the rise of humans. And basically what I have here today is a lot of presentation style information, mostly what I took from undergraduate college courses on philosophy. So I'm not sure how many people are going to come in. Kaiser, if you want to do if you want to join in and help talk through some of this information, I'll give you a link, although it's going to be pretty autistic. I'm just going to be going through presentations on the history of science and the ancient Greeks and empiricism and the scientific method. And I'll be doing presentation style, looking at the chat in between presentations. And we'll see how many people come in or ask questions. So I'll be checking the chat in between presentations. So let me just get started. There's a lot of stuff I wanted to get through, and relatively this is just the beginning. I'm not even going to be able to cover consciousness, which is the main thing I'd like to be able to cover. And so what I have here is quite a few basic overviews of history of science. So why don't I start with actually, let me get a smaller one to start with. So I mentioned a lot of Aristotle and Plato. This one's a pretty quick one. Just going to check again to make sure that this is working. Just want to make sure this is working. So this stream's going to be pretty autistic. If someone does find this interesting and wants to join in, I'll even let them join in and talk through it. But I wanted to cover this detail to put a positivistic view when we think of the soul and spirituality, what we're basing off of the relative newness of mechanistic understandings of nature, what science says, what it doesn't say. And I mentioned to JF, he didn't seem such a big expert in Aristotle and Plato. Obviously had heard of them. He didn't know what really they'd said. So here we got Plato, 427 to 347 BC, student of Socrates. People could pause and look back at some of these slides and, to understand, you say everything in the empiric world is a manifestation of a pure form idea that Plato believed in the spirit world and the material realm. And, the material world is base and the spiritual world is perfect. So such ideas like the chair, rocks, cats, people have a pure form in the spirit world, and then the material world have representations and, the sensory experience, and more could be found from trusting the intellect and intellectual contemplation endeavors than sensory experience, which is more the scientific method that will come thousands of years later, the power of experimentation and examining the spiritual world, as opposed to the power of meditation, turning internally, and pure intellect. So, he's got the role of forms, knowledge, mathematics and thinking. You have visible things and belief. And what could you trust more? Could you trust more your thoughts and your spiritual connection to the spiritual worlds, or what you see with your eyes in the phenomenon in the material world? You have Platonism on psychology and the soul. Personality factor is more real than manifestation. He's got the, we believe in empirical fact, like the fact that there are 7 continents on the earth and 8 you go through that. Plato's got the famous story of the cave in the Republic, where prisoners are trapped in the cave, and they could only see shadows of what's happening in the eternal world. And that's really similar to the scientific method. How do we know what is empiricism, what is experimenting? We have to use the facilities we have at hand, what we could see from the physical world, even though our capacity is very small. And Plato's example of that is the cave, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. The nature of the soul. Plato said the soul had three parts: the rational component, the spiritual component, and the desire component. There's the idea of true knowledge. You have to suppress the needs of the body and concentrate on the rational mind, negating the physicality to use the rational soul to connect to the spirit worlds and decipher true understanding of what's actually happening. And humans relate to what part of the three different souls is stronger and how we relate to the world. All this is pretty interesting, but we're going to get what is knowledge, what do we know? And as many scholars would say, everything is basically a dispute between Plato and Aristotle. They discussed everything, they debated everything. So to some extent, my debate with JF was basically a rehash of debates between Plato and Aristotle. So the question, how does one come to know the forms if they can't be known through sensory experience? And I mentioned to JF like the perfect circle, where I have the concept in my head of a perfect circle, although in the actual physical reality, there is no such thing as a perfect circle. And like the concept of a chair or a human, there's so many different forms and gradations and different, that there is the thing of a human or a chair is an idea that doesn't actually exist. So that Plato hypothesized that these ideas don't actually exist in the material world, they exist in the spiritual world. The soul is implanted in the body, and Plato, argues with that Socrates and the immortality of the soul, and that knowledge is a derivative of the soul. And as the soul enters the body, the knowledge begins to be contaminated by sensory information, and that sensory information actually probably has a negative effect on the power of knowledge. And so the best way to obtain knowledge is actually to ignore sensory experience. And so this stream would probably be quite autistic, very intellectual, but this is really the precursor to understanding the scientific method and, a religious approach where you say you trust scripture alone or God alone, and actually say sensory experience is not a positive thing, it's a negative thing for being able to decipher the truth. People see these slides, and then we get Aristotle, who is the student of Plato, and he's the teacher of Alexander the Great. And he thinks about everything. He extensively, till today, Aristotle has tens of books on all types of topics. And you really had encyclopedic knowledge and thought about all types of issues. But today we will just be focusing on the scientific method and the soul. So Aristotle differences from Plato. He didn't think that forms have a separate existence from particulars. And Aristotle wanted to study things in the empirical world and through observation, which is much closer to the scientific method that we use today. And Aristotle was basically a materialist. It held that the soul, so to say, rises and connected to the material, maybe not immortal. And in terms of knowledge, all types of knowledge could be prized. He had three types of knowledge: theoretical, practical, productive. And he thought that only knowledge was capable through sensation. He compared the mind to a blank slate, tabula rasa. I'm sure most of you have heard of this, and so I'm going to go over a lot of this quickly because there's a lot to cover. Although Aristotle, unlike Plato, didn't think sense perception was very useful at all to knowledge, he believed in sense perception, but not only sense perception. He had deduction and induction, and obviously Aristotle did believe in the soul and the gods and the spirit worlds also. Causes, Aristotle's theory of causes: material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, final cause. And Aristotle will have the prime mover argument that we're going to get into later for the first cause. In the psyche, what exactly Aristotle held the psyche resides in the heart and not the brain. So interesting in that matter. Plato was correct at that time relatively to modern thought that the brain was the origin of the psyche. Aristotle thought it was the heart. And he also had hierarchy of souls: vegetative soul, senseless soul, rational soul that's only possessed by human, and provides all the function of the other souls. And so Aristotle would have also agreed that intelligence, logic is a derivative of the soul. He talks about a lot of things: dreams, sleep, humor, all very interesting. I recommend people to learn Aristotle. Yeah, and golden mean, since we're talking about Aristotle, like Maimonides, the famous rabbi, quotes Aristotle, the desirable middle ground between any two extremes in terms of everything that we do. Very good advice. Happiness as an end into itself, which were maybe different from the Stoics of the time, where Aristotle wasn't a hedonist, but he did hold that there was a purpose to happiness, and that happiness might be the ultimate purpose. And politics, he held many today, that humans desire to leave an image of themselves behind after death. Man is a natural political animal, the only animal endowed by speech. Only some men are free. So very interesting. That was probably the quickest of what I'm going to talk about. You want to get some of this information out here, and some of this is actually going to be extremely complicated, and some of it will be more simple. So let me pound through some of these quicker ones first. And as all of these are basically from university courses. These are PowerPoints that I took from various different universities. So let's do a little bit more of the ancient Greek world. Let's start with the foundations of all of this: Aristotle and Plato. And as I said, almost everything that me and JF discussed was basically a commentary on the early debates between Aristotle and Plato. So map of ancient Europe, the Mediterranean. Here you have Plato, Aristotle next to each other, student and teacher. And Plato's looking for the eternal and unchanging. So where Aristotle's more into observation of the changing. Plato's against the senses, and the senses confuse what's real, as Aristotle believes the senses is what is the only way to obtain reality. Plato, abstract ideas subsist in ideal forms, and Aristotle, general ideas are abstractations from particular things. And Plato, dialectic arguments, leads us to true first principles, as where Aristotle, all science must begin with hypothesis or observation. In general, science today in universities, especially JF's understanding, is Aristotelian in nature, and a lot of my thought is Platonic in nature. Can virtue be taught? Meno's paradox. Interesting things. The sophists, common enemies of both Plato and Aristotle, where argumentation, like the people said sophistry, for example, it's just sophistry is a philosophical argumentation, just a skill for the sake of winning arguments as opposed to seeking truth. Humans are the measure of all things, of the things that they are, of the things they are not that they are not. It's Protagoras. Truth is irrelevant since it is essentially relative, which is generally not respected among science today, sophistry, although that was a common school today, as it was in the time of Plato and Aristotle, that they were in agreement that they disagreed with the sophists. Here's an example further: Plato's cave, of the nature of the soul, the reality of perception. I encourage people who haven't read the Republic or to familiarize themselves with these ancient ideas that are still very powerful today. In paradoxes, like how do you they're both mathematicians. How do you construct a square double the size of the same square? And here will come to a solution. Very geometric ways of understanding. So what was Plato getting at with this geometric understanding? And so Plato said that we recollect things we don't really understand or think. It's like a spiritual, prophetic type nature where things come down from on high to the lower realms. We can only reach this knowledge by recognizing our ignorance and ceasing to be distracted by our sensible things. And then the divine Your dialectic argument brings out the mind, out of the mind what experience is incapable of putting in the mind. The ideas that we know in this way are more precise and certain than any information we get from our senses and are eternally true. So Plato's ideas, the forms, which we talked about in the other lecture, which this stuff's really important to get down. So I have like 3 different PowerPoints that are going over these ideas because I want to understand it for myself and other people. To really, you got to really know your Greeks. You got to know your Plato and Aristotle, really, for anything scientific, philosophical, legal, metaphysical. You got to know your Greeks. You got to know your Plato and Aristotle. So it's worth the time to review this and try to get it good. So Platonic forms, and I tried to explain this to JF, and he sounded like he'd never heard it before. Abstract general notions are never fully realized by concrete particular things, which can only participate in the ideas. Therefore, particular things can never teach us these notions, but it can only remind us of notions that are already there in our minds. A person who focuses on the sensible world of particular things is therefore like a people in the cave looking at the shadows and mistaking them for realities. Teachers are those who ask themselves questions and enable us to recollect the ideas by reasoning from particular things. Very important to try to understand, this and how we look at reality and how we look at science and say our perception is limited. At best, we're trying to figure out what's really there from looking at shadows. We're stuck in the cave. We're in this material form. Our ability to decipher the truth is extremely small, close to nothing. If we have any ability to decipher the truth, it's through the soul or spiritual power. And these forms, we could decipher that there are these perfect forms and ideas that are out there, but they don't really correspond to the reality of the material world that we live in. In connection to the account for the soul, the rational soul of a human is part that is capable of understanding the ideas. It existed before the body and survives the death of the body. We say consciousness, which we're not going to talk too much about today, which I'd like to, is a consciousness predated humanity. Consciousness permeates all of reality, the whole universe, and so to say, we just tap into consciousness. There's different understandings of it, but the Platonic idea is very powerful. Before the soul joins with the body, it is direct knowledge of the ideas. Being joined with the body causes it to be confused by sensory imagery, and we must work to free itself to contemplate the ideas again. All of our ideas of what is the eternal world of being come to the soul before it is immersed in the confusing and ephemeral world of becoming. This is why the knowledge of ideas is really recollection. And so if you're religious, you might have the idea of scripture too. So like the soul, so Aristotle's talking pure intellect, and later the Neoplatonists, the Christians and Judeo-Islamic ones, will look at scripture as the source of knowledge more so than the reality of the physical world. And more divisions according to the Platonic understanding. So now to Aristotle's theory of universal. So Plato held that there was these ideals that existed in the spiritual realm, such as categories, the forms. So according to Aristotle, there is really no such thing as dog or justice or equality. There are only particular dogs, particular things, particular pair of things that happen to be equal to one another. Humans do not have the ability to contemplate the forms directly. Instead, we have the ability to classify them according to common characteristics. Abstract notions are just names we give to the general classes of things. Each field of human knowledge has classifications and degrees of precision that are appropriate to its objects. So this is extremely important to try to grasp this and understand, because this is really the foundation of science and the foundation of what me and JF were arguing, where he was at best coming on to the Aristotelian ideas, where you're saying, no, there are no perfect spiritual forms, and even though there is no perfect circle, there's a concept of the circle, and this is just the best we use, and we give words to these inaccuracies, but that's the best we could do in the form that we have. But the idea of the good, Plato, the good is an idea in which all good things participate. It is an object of our intellectual knowledge if we can see past the distractions of sensible things. The good is the true. The good is the fundamental truth, and the pursuit of the truth is the fundamental good. In Aristotle, there is no singular idea of the good. Instead, there is a good that is appropriate to each art or science. Every art and every science aims at the good. Hence, it has been well said that the good is that at which all things aim. By the nature of the good will depend on the nature of the subject. Further, Aristotle and the good, every being has certain potentialities appropriate to its nature. The good for any being is the actualization of its potential. In Greek, that's the entelechy. For human beings, the unique potentiality is the capacity for rational thought. Therefore, the highest good for human is the activity of rational contemplation. In general, the good, according to Aristotle, is not particular idea as it is for Plato. Instead, it's a disposition to act in a certain way that is appropriate to the nature of the agent. Human excellence will be the disposition that makes one a good man and causes him to perform his functions well. In the golden mean, different principles. Later you have the golden rule: do unto others as you have done unto them, Confucius and Christ. The categorical imperative of Kant: act so as to treat others as ends in themselves, never as means to an end. The greatest happiness principle of Bentham: act so as to bring about the greatest possible good for the greatest number of people. And the two most important things in life: never rat out your friends and always keep your mouth shut. So on to say that these are all largely based on Aristotle. And as I've said quite a few times now, everything is basically a footnote on Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle's theory of the soul is not an entity that can exist separately from the body. The soul is related to the body as actuality to potentiality. The soul constitutes the actualization of certain potentialities that the body has to act in certain ways. Therefore, the nature of the soul depends on the nature of the body whose soul is in. If the eye had a soul, it would be seeing. So say JF was more in tune. He actually held that the soul rises from the physical. Aristotle obviously believed in the spiritual worlds, but he thought the soul was directly dependent upon the physical, as where Plato held it was separate. And he says different types of soul: nutritive, sensitive, motor, rational. All were studying the moral theory of the soul. Plato's account of the good is intimately connected with an account of the soul as something whose essence is separate from that of the body, and whose capacity for rational thought depends on a virtual or actual separation from the body. Aristotle's account of the good is intimately connected with an account of the soul as something that is essentially bound to a body of a certain kind with certain capacities, and that represents the actualization of the body's highest potential. Okay, through 2 of these, 6 more to go. Got 6 people watching. You want to come on and talk through this content and go through some of these PowerPoints? Are you listening? And I got 6 more of these to talk through. I really wanted to hash out. I actually have some stuff from Platonus that you had your previous handle to, that his philosophy is actually relevant to what we're talking about, and we're going to be talking about it. But yeah, I wanted to put this out there and have increase the intellectual content, and the people that follow and look at this, maybe you've read quite a bit of Aristotle and Plato. It's extremely important. It's the heart of what we're talking about, and I'm going to get more into the more recent science and the development of the scientific method and the scientific revolution and the enlightenment in Europe. But first, I wanted to cover the Greeks. So back to the Greeks. These are, as I said, these are all taken from different university courses, PowerPoints that I was able to find online. Pre-Socratic, you had Thales thinking about the world without first thinking about gods. Just a history of the development of ideas, where you could look at Hindu theology and different concepts, but God in all things. The pre-Socratic were Thales, so God's in everything. They were thinking about things, but weren't able to reach such great. Pythagoras, starts looking in ideas. So not just the power of God in everything, the elements, but actually step-by-step reasoning and number, mathematics. Pythagoras is extremely important for the development of Western thought, besides the Pythagorean theorem, and even the kind of the worship of mathematics, which could be related to what will come, the Newtonian mechanistic nature, and even modern day science, which is somewhat Pythagorean in nature, was a cult where they worshipped numbers and mathematics, mechanistic understandings. Socrates, was executed, obviously. He said, knowledge is virtue, ignorance is the cause of evil. And he had the dialectic argument, which is related to Pilpul, Talmudic Pilpul, proposal, answer, counter answer. And obviously he's Plato's teacher, and he didn't leave any writings. So most of what we know from Socrates is brought through Plato, who has play on the death of Aristotle. And now we're to Plato. Human beings is really soul that fell from the stars. Plato had the idea similar to a lot of Christians till today. Mormons and even Kabbalists. A lot of people say that Kabbalah comes from ancient Greek wisdom, but whatever the idea was that, the soul being trapped in the body, or, the origins of the soul, where it comes from, in, the ideal forms that we talked about, the ideal city-state and the republic, and in the foundations of Greek society that really lead to the foundations of Western society, world society till today. More pictures of the cave. Aristotle, member of Plato's Academy, systematic scientific classification, theology, purpose, God is the prime mover, very revered by the church today. Aristotle, the spiritualists till today are probably more Platonic, as opposed to academics are more Aristotelian. As Aristotle wrote about almost everything that's studied till today, and most of his arguments are still pretty solid. Then, further the Christians, you have cynics, Stoics, virtue based on good, indifferent to suffering. Your Neo-Platonists, who basically the body is bad, the spirit is good. Augustine, belief in order to understand. And I'm not sure how much we're going to discuss Augustine, but Augustine is also very important to the development of science and the idea that the reason being used to try to understand Scripture and God's purpose for us. In the scholastics, St. Anselm, the ontological argument, which I'm going to be discussing soon. God is something than which nothing can be greater than thought. An argument simply from thinking, not from observation. Anselm's argument for this proof of God is a thought experiment. And here is St. Anselm's ontological argument, still popular till today. That by definition, God is that which nothing can be greater than. The concept of God exists. Can't there be something which nothing is greater than? So it's possible that God is the greatest thing that exists. If God exists only in the mind and is only a possible being, then if he existed in reality, he would have been greater. So God is a being, that which a greater can be thought, which is impossible, hence God exists. A very simple logical argument, thought experiment, which to some extent logically is a proof of the existence of a greater spiritual force, a God, a single God, a monotheistic ability. And there's quite a few of these arguments. So you could look into it. There's whole lectures, hour lectures on this ontological argument. So I'll leave the slide up a few seconds so people could look at it and you could do your own research on it. But, just wanted to put this out here. You have Thomas Aquinas, influenced by Aristotle, 5 ways, 5 arguments for the existence of the soul, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. So, Anselm has the ontological argument, and Aquinas has the cosmological and teleological arguments. His five ways. 1, everything is changing, but something must have caused it. Every effect must have a cause. Things come into existence and cease to exist. There must be a cause. Excellence must come from perfection. The harmony of things suggests designs. This all must be God, similar to like the prime mover argument. Also, there's a lot of information on this. Anyone who wants to do more research on these arguments, I encourage them to. I just wanted to put this out there, and actually we'll be covering this more as we go on. But there's a lot to cover, and people, this is just the springboard for a lifetime of research and more research that I hope we'll be able to continue. But I just wanted to put this out there because I wasn't able to express any of this in my debate with JF. Cosmological argument. The role of the cosmos being the role of the universe is based on what could be seen. Concept of contingency, dependent on something that may or may not happen. So it's unmoved mover. First way, everything that is in motion is moved by something else. Infinite regress is impossible. Emphasis on dependency. It is necessary to arrive at the first mover moved by no other. And this everyone understands to be God. And actually, if anyone followed the duties of the heart, we covered a lot of these arguments in there. And, to say that we know we live in a cause and effect world. And, I'll actually have a few further slides that will have arguments on these and modern takes. So that the on-cause causer, everything happened has a cause. Infinite regress is impossible. Emphasis on agency. There is no case known in which a thing is found to be different, to be the efficient cause of itself. You can't cause yourself. It is necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God. In possibility and necessity, things come into being and later cease to exist. some contingent beings exist. If any contingent being exists, then necessary being must exist, because we know that things are born and die and were created and cease to exist. There must be something that always existed. That thing must be God. Excellence. In this world, there is a scale of more good and less good. There cannot be an infinite scale. There must be, therefore, exist perfection at one end of the scale, which is what everyone knows as God. In the teleological argument, telos, end or purpose, focus on order, regularity, benefit, and purpose. Analogy recalls Plato, all things ordered by the mind based on what could be seen. The argument from design, everything works into some purpose. Observed beneficial results suggest there's a pattern of direction behind this. There must be a God. Whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it is being directed. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their ends, and this being we call God. The Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas has multiple of these proofs of God. Question of miracle. God does what nature could never do. God does what nature could do, but in a different sequence or connection. God does what nature can do, but from his power. So very interesting. So now, keep on moving. Just the history of some of these thoughts and ideas about theology. So we have William Occam, and actually someone in the super chat in JF's channel mentioned Occam's razor. Entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessary, all being equal except the simplest answer, which I said the simplest answer is the soul. And obviously Occam was a religious man, a theologian in and of himself, and he believed the simplest answer was the soul by fact. Although today people will use Occam's razor for heretical ideas, Occam in fact created Occam's razor to prove God and prove the soul as the simplest answer. Then we're going to start entering the age of science. So this slide shows a good transition from the Greeks to the modern time. Thomas Hobbes, materials, God is matter, which we saw earlier in the pre-Socratic times. Like I say, even a lot of these ideas that keep on coming back time after time, really the Greeks had debated these things. The natural state of human beings is to be at war. Society prevents falling back to the state social contract. Hobbes and the state social contract, political thinker. And this is going to be the backbone of the scientific Renaissance. The rationalists, Descartes, but relatively all these people are theologians and believers. Atheism doesn't really start till the 19th century. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, philosophical framework for the natural sciences, mathematician, deduction from the reality of mind, not perception from the senses. And people know like the Cartesian coordinates where we have like X and Y. That's Descartes. Cartesian means Descartes. So he was a famous mathematician that anybody who took algebra and is, drawn out, lines of y equals mx plus b, that's Descartes. Spinoza, the Jew, Baruch Spinoza, converted to Christianity, interesting in and of himself. Also, like Mayavadi theology, the universe is one, mind and body just different ways of conceiving this one reality. There's just one reality. There's not, the dualist who held that there was a physical world and a material world, as opposed, they're really just different representations of the same thing. And therefore, Spinoza is saying there really isn't any free will. John Locke, and now we're having the beginning of empiricism. Empiricist, which, JF uses, how do you look for things? Empirical. Everything we know is derived from experience. Sounds, the mind at birth is a tabula rasa. Sounds familiar, like Aristotle. Primary objective reality, secondary subjective ideas in the mind, qualities of the object. So he's looking completely different than Plato and even more going further out than Aristotle. And he's saying the primary thing is the material world, and what we think about it is only secondary of importance. And which still relates to modern debates between scientists and atheists on the nature of ideas. What can science show and what can it show? How much can we understand? David Hume, anything not given experience is to be discarded. Therefore, there is no God, self-causation, inductive knowledge. You're getting the beginnings of atheism. I am nothing but a bundle of perceptions. Miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. So here, Hume is starting the turn towards atheism and mechanistic understanding. Hume is already after Isaac Newton and, or contemporaries of Isaac Newton. And he's already starting to, claims of miracles are from the ignorant and barbarous people, poor quality in testimony. And, because generally miracles, even among scientists, had been accepted, even Newton. And, many of the great thinkers up till now had believed in miracles. The science and the church had basically been integrally connected up until this point. Science and religion were one and the same. In fact, physics and science was actually a subdivision of theology up until this point. You get William Paley, who pushed back a little bit on Hume, evidence of creation and design, the clockmaker example that's still used to till today, the theological return of the theological argument of intelligent design. And here again, we have the theological argument. And crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, I might possibly answer that it had lain there forever, but suppose I found a watch upon the ground, I would hardly think the answer which I be given before when it come to the inspect the watch we perceive, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, hence creation, man has to have a purpose. And more of the theological argument. So Paley is updating, saying to Anselm's argument with the watch example, and is applying that to the planets, gravity, the solar system, as the scientists are starting to figure out and understand, give mechanistic understandings for this. Paley is saying that really these things are here to glorify God, and even these scientific mechanistic understandings that we're starting to understand the nature is not coming to reject God, but is coming to glorify God. Immanuel Kant and the idealist, categories for incoming sense data, categorical imperative, a universal moral law, a moral argument for the existence of God. So Kant comes on to morals that God because the necessity of having morals and right and wrong. Right and wrong is derived from God. We recognize an obligation to achieve the highest standard of goodness, and this goodness should be rewarded by happiness. Good and happy, the summa bonum, the highest good ought to happen. So it has to be possible, but while we can achieve good, we can't always ensure happiness as well. Therefore, there must be a God who can do this. This is the famous Immanuel Kant. As I said, Immanuel Kant was a contemporary of Moses Mendelssohn. Hegel, the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthetic, and progression towards absolute truth. Marx, materialist, atheistic dialectic materialism. So Marx is coming on. Now you're getting stronger forms of atheism. Socialism, the necessary outcome of economic conflict. Religion keeps the oppressed quiet. So now you're getting atheistic thought and anti-religious understanding due to the new mechanistic understanding of science. Feuerbach, people are scared to face up to the fact that there's nothing after death, so they make up the father figure they would like to be real. To the present day, you have the existentialists, the human predicament, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre, linguistic, the Wittgenstein, religious statements not open to the truth of falsity, that the scientific rigor that we could apply to the material world can't be applied to religious statements, and JF was giving a lot of these similar arguments. Paul Tillich, philosophy frames the questions to which theologically brings the answers, saying philosophy and science are never really going to be able to provide the why answers. Only theology could answer the why. And more stuff out there through Dawkins. So does philosophy offer proof of the existence of God? No, but some more recent philosophers argue that there is a demonstrator weight of probability that makes the belief in God an intellectually defensible claim, which I said to JF that the possibility of the soul is just as reasonable as evolution. You can't really explain who we are, why we got here, what's the purpose of life, what drives us, what's the origin of the thoughts in our heads, and so on and so on. There's no scientific answers to these questions. And you say that even though we can't scientifically, under the same materialistic, mechanistic methods, prove the soul, that we could say it's at least as likely that the spirit world is the answer to these questions, and say you're going to hit a dead end looking for material mechanistic answers to these questions. So if you have any desire to know the answer to these questions, the only ability is to turn to the spiritual. Awesome. So these, this college course, it's okay. Just checking the chat now. Instead of putting out there, I'm not sure, John, if you want to come on, if someone wants to come on and talk through some more of these. I'm going to keep on going because this is important to me. I just want that information out there. No, all these slides I took from college courses. So I'll just put the Google Chats in the link if someone's got the courage and wants to come through. But I'm basically, I want to go through these presentations, and these are all undergraduate college courses on the history of either philosophy, history of science, philosophy of science, and I've got 8 of them. So there's a lot to it. And I really wanted, because I said this wasn't when I was debating JF, I just took the negative position on evolution, and I wasn't taking a positive position on spirituality of the soul, the source of consciousness. I was just purely arguing the negative against evolution. And I saw in the comments in the chat, and a lot of people had questions on it, a lot of people attacking me, and a lot of people. And my point was, you don't have to feel stupid to believe in God and to believe in the soul. And even there are spiritual methods, and you could be a scientist and a spiritualist, and you could apply certainly rationalism, logic, empiricism, and the scientific method to the spiritual world. But it's not going to be the same as the mechanistic material things that we use science for. So the links in the chat. I hope people are enjoying this. But I want that information out there, and if you guys are enjoying chatting with each other, like I said, I want to increase the intellectual. The people who are streaming or listen to me, I want to have higher intellectual outcomes on these chats. So I'm kind of just going through the shortest ones first. That one's pretty long, but so let's do this long one. This one's got a lot of slides. The links in the chat. If someone's got the courage and wants to jump in and offer some thoughts on what I'm talking about. This one's 280 slides, but it's more history. There's not much reading. It's just like a history of science till the scientific revolution. The first picture, Kepler, Copernicus, Newton, Galileo, Descartes, Ptolemy. And I really want people to understand the history of science, how for thousands of years people were spiritual, Christian, the church, part of the Catholic Church, and then the rise of atheism and how well we understood these ideas. A little carrot juice. So, science has always challenged the old ideas. So here we're talking about heliocentric, to people that always thought the Earth was in the center, largely till Copernicus come around, Polish astronomer. He proposes the sun's in the center. Usually, historically, the main science was astronomy, as the Bible says that God gave us the stars to say the time of the holidays. When is Easter and the solstice and the years. It was important. Everyone needed to know basic astronomy. It was important to everybody. So the church sponsored people to study this stuff, and almost all of the original astronomers, physicists worked together with the church or were even sponsored by the church. Mathematics, Copernicus, the good history. People could pause if they want to see these streams. So anyone who knows this history with the, who study the history of science or physics, celestial mechanics, probably knows these names in some of these stuff that was written. Copernicus writes on the revolution of the heavenly spheres. And he proposed a new sun-centric view, and that was in conflict. He did not reject the Ptolemaic vision of the fixed spheres. He just held that the sun was in the center. And we're going to get into the scientific method. He was convicted. His books, had a hard time being published, and he comes into problems with trying to change the church understanding of the time that had the earth in the center. And actually, I will argue till today, heliocentrism and actually modern physics now allows for a better understanding of heliocentrism than ancient times. If you think, like the Earth goes around the sun, and the sun goes around the Milky Way, and the Milky Way goes around bigger galaxies. But what everything's going around each other. What's really still? Is anything still? Is everything in movement? What's the center of the universe? Could anything potentially be the center of the movement of the universe? And most scientists will hold frame of reference, and it's conceivable that any given point in the universe could be the center, and certainly that one point at the center could be the Earth, although it'd be a more complicated model. So we don't think that the sun's the center of the universe. We just think that the gravitation, the Earth goes around the sun, and the sun goes around the center of the Milky Way, and the Milky Way goes around heavier galaxies. And so we really don't know what's in the center. We have no clue. And so to postulate that the Earth is the center, the sun is the center, to some extent, you could say the Earth is in the center, but that's neither here or there. But just I'm trying to give this birth of modern science from empiricism. I'm going to go through these quickly. Bruno, the Italian monk who believes Copernicus is right and does more research on it. Bruno is part of the Inquisition, spends 7 years in prison, tried as a heretic, and burned at the stake. Brahe, Dutch astronomer. Kepler, who we ate too soon, but he, just a wealthy aristocrat who had the ability to gaze at the stars and was extremely good at it, had good records. And Kepler becomes a student of the wealthy Brahe. And, Kepler is from the first to give mathematical explanations of how these mechanisms work. And here we're looking at observations. So obviously the Babylonians, in terms of astronomy, everyone always had observations. The Greeks and everyone, they observed the motions of the stars and the constellations, and we have good charts going back thousands of years. The Babylonians, the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Indians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Hebrews, all of us, our ancients, observed the movements of the stars, but we didn't really have theories. We did have predictions, like we were able to show how long orbits were and predicting when stars and constellations would appear. Almost every ancient society was able to come up with these, but we didn't have mechanistic understandings like equations like we have until Kepler comes. We had mathematics, but the combination of the two is really coming in the 15th, 16th century. And we see Newton puts a lot of this stuff together. Say that it's not elliptical, not circular. And the three laws of Kepler, people have learned that, people have taken basic physics. And he actually has, mathematical, the square of the period is proportional to the cube of the radius. And, this really could be lectures and lectures, a lot to get through. And these people were mathematicians also. Galileo and further laws of motion, dropping weights, acceleration, the mathematical formula with the acceleration being proportional to the square of and so we start coming to these understandings, what's gravity, heliocentrism versus going around the sun, and actually starting to work out mathematical laws of motion that could predict observations. And we all know, like, people could look up the history of Galileo. It's very interesting. And he's in prison. Galileo had been friends with the Pope. And relatively, Galileo was a devout man. He was friendly with the church. He was funded with the church. He was a childhood friend with the Pope. Galileo is put on trial by Pope Urban VII, who was his childhood friend, for the Inquisition. Due to heretical ideas, he's placed under house arrest. And we all know this history. And here, this is similar to St. Augustine. If people are familiar, how do you look at science and reason as compared to scripture? And Galileo, the great scientist who caused so much problems and led to really almost all of modern science is partially based on Galileo. Is I'm inclined to think that the authority of the Holy Scripture is intended to convince men of those truths which are necessary for their salvation, and which bring far above man's understanding, cannot be made credible by any learning, or any other means than revelation by the Holy Spirit. But that same God has endowed us with senses, reason, and understanding, does not permit us to use them, and desires to acquaint us in any other way with such knowledge as we are in position to acquire for ourselves by means of those faculties, that it seems to me I'm not bound to believe, especially concerning those scientists about which the Holy Scriptures contain only small fragments and varying conclusions. And this is precisely the case with astronomy, of which there is so little that the planets are not even all enumerated. You're very important. So I'm just trying to get through this quickly. Here's Galileo's fourth statement. I, Galileo, the son that he was forced to sign after his trial. I, Galileo, son of the late Vincenzo Galileo, Florentine, aged 70 years old, arraigned personally before this tribunal, kneeling before you, most eminent and revered Lord Cardinals, Inquisitor General against heretical depravity throughout the entire Christian Commonwealth, having before my eyes and touching with my hands the Holy Gospels, swear that I have always believed, do believe, and by God's help will in the future believe all that is held, preached, and taught by the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. But whereas after an injunction had been judicially intimated to me by the Holy Office to the effect that I must altogether abandon the false opinion that the sun is the center of the world and immovable, and that the earth is not the center of the world and moves, and that I must not hold, defend, or teach in any way whatsoever, verbally or in writing, the said false doctrine. And after it had been notified to me that the doctrine was contrary to Holy Scripture, I wrote and printed a book in which I discussed this new doctrine already condemned and introduced arguments of great cogency in its favor without presenting any solutions of these. And for these reasons, I have been pronounced by the Holy Office to be vehemently suspected of heresy, that is to say, of having held and believed that the sun is the center of the world and immovable, and the earth is not the center and moves. And as I said, actually, modern physics comes to show that it could be that the earth actually is in the center and does not move. Galileo and the telescope, and he did a lot of important things, astronomy. The implications of his discoveries are profound, and we're going to see, in these slides coming of really all of this is, Newton, and the rise of science is largely based on Galileo. Here's Galileo on science and scripture, and we already read that earlier. Now, what is the scientific method? Make an observation, ask a question, form a hypothesis, conduct an experiment, and either accept or reject the hypothesis. Pretty simple. But after Galileo, we're starting to develop the scientific method. Francis Bacon is, basically considered the father of the modern day scientific method. Rene Descartes, who we talked about in the previous one, father of deduction, and he was more into thought, deduction, and mathematical logic than the scientific method. He believed that one could start with self-evident truths comparable to geometric axioms and deduce more complex conclusions, as opposed to the scientific method where you look at the world, form a hypothesis, and test it. Isaac Newton is going to be the synthesis of Bacon and Descartes, and the scientific method is really born from Newton and his optics, and he becomes head of the Royal Society of London, senior ranking Freemason, and to some extent Newton is one of the most influential men in all of history. Synthesizes these two systems into a simple scientific methodology using Bacon's empiricism and Descartes' rationalism. The scientific method began with systematic observations and experiments, which were then used to arrive at general concepts. New deductions derived from these general concepts could then be tested and verified by precise instruments. So from Bacon to Newton. So Bacon emphasized arriving at conclusions about nature using inductive reason, or making generalizations from particular observations and experiments organized to test an hypothesis. He believed science was to give humankind new discoveries and the power to serve human purposes by conquering nature and action. Control and domination of nature became an important concern of science and its accompanying technology. Induction, very useful. read up on Bacon if you're interested in this. The father of the scientific method. He served Elizabeth I, lawyer to kings and queens. He was made a lord. And like JF, he said, that knowledge about the world should not depend on the ancients like Aristotle, as opposed to many at his time who thought everything we did should be in line with the ancients. Develop our own ideas, build up evidence, observe, conduct experiments, prove if the ideas were true or false. Bacon, no pleasure is comparable to the standing upon the vantage ground of truth. Some books are to be tested, others to be swallowed, and a few are to be chewed and digested. So this empiricism, that we have Bacon, to think of it, a priori method of medieval scholasticism. You had Descartes, which we had discussed earlier, the significance of doubt, the deductive method, spatial relationships can be expressed in mathematical formulas, analytical geometry. Some of the importance of scientific ideas as opposed to Bacon, who just have these theories and hypotheses, to Descartes, to saying that these ideas should fit exact mathematical formulas. As anyone who takes science today, everything, physics, and there's thousands and thousands of formulas that, I'm an engineer. In almost every field of engineering, there's countless formulas that will show how things operate, and they could predict basically within complete accuracy of how things will act in a mechanical explanation. The cognito ergo sum, the only thing you can rationally be sure of is your own existence. Descartes was like a dualist who, as opposed to Spinoza, who thought there were two different things, mind and matter, that made matter something inert and independent of the observer that could be investigated by detached rationality. So Descartes is more Platonic in that sense. Discourse on Method, great book. I've looked through it. If you have the time to try to read that, try it. If you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life you doubt as far as possible all things. Doubt everything. Obviously, Descartes, geometry, the XY is called the Cartesian planes. Every person in grade school learns Descartes' wisdom. Back to Galileo, testing, the speed, dropping the two different balls off the Tower of Pisa and saying they fall at the same speed. And, here we're to Isaac Newton, possibly the greatest scientist who ever lived. One of the greatest men in the effect of the modern world, bringing together Galileo's discoveries about the Earth and Kepler's formulas, develops the calculus, explains heavenly motion. Provided a synthesis superior to Aristotle. He's got his three theories of motion. This could take forever, so I'm going to have to go through this quickly, but I encourage everybody to study as much about Isaac Newton as possible. Theory of light, optics, physics, gravity, the legend of the apple, universal gravitation, forming exact formulas for how universal gravitation, forming the calculus to show the nature of connection between change, motion, acceleration, advances in the telescope. So the implication of Newton's law were enormous, for he demonstrated with one universal law mathematically proved that all motion in the universe, from the movements of the planets to an apple falling off a tree, could be explained. The Newtonian synthesis created a new cosmology in which the world was largely seen in mechanistic terms. This would remain the dominant cosmology until Einstein, and even after Einstein, it's largely till today. We bring in some other names, Faraday, with electromagnetism. So, after Newton, all types of things start being explained to this new mechanistic. So we had Descartes and Bacon, and Newton really unified these different scientific theories in that we were able to start explaining all different types of things in mechanistic ways. And there's going to be a lot of slides, and I'll try to go through these quickly, of just the power of Newton's idea applied to so many different things. Faraday, encourage people to learn more about that. Like we owe a lot to Faraday. Cavendish, Henry Cavendish, conductivity, electricism. I encourage people to pause it and look through these slides. And we look at anatomy and medicine. You get the printing press, the revival in classics, the first time that the church is being seriously criticized, the voyages to the new worlds, shipping, the global world. We didn't mention Leonardo da Vinci, also very important in this. Biology and chemistry, different workings. William Harvey in the 1600s discovers that the heart is for the purpose of pumping blood and distributing oxygen, the circulatory system. Till then, it wasn't known. Vesalius starts coming up with accurate anatomical drawings of the human body. Anthony van Leeuwenhoek uses the microscope and starts seeing the cell. Hooke, Robert Hooke, and the cell. All these different discoveries happening in the same era of time, what we call the scientific revolution, and then the mechanistic understandings for how these things work. Poisoning and disease, Paracelsus. Till then, you had Aristotle, Galen, the famous Roman anatomist, who generally had anatomy of the human body based on the dissection of animals. And, Galen had thought the brain, like Aristotle, was a cooling agent, and that the soul rests in the heart. And until Paracelsus, who they say was a grave robber, and that's how he was able to, by robbing graves, was able to discover the true human anatomy, overthrows 1,500 years of Galenic understanding, Roman understanding of anatomy, like the four humors. Anyone reads ancient texts in biology, and you see you had the four different humors and the different colors in the blood, and the bloodletting and leeches, and that were still used even possibly into modern times based on this Galenic understanding of anatomy. Surgeons at that time were the doctors were intellectuals, and the actual surgeons were usually cheaply paid staff. Grave robbing. All very interesting. Vesalius, Belgium anatomist, physician, and here's a famous picture of anatomical surgery, class discussion, and usually the lecturer would have been someone different than the one doing the actual cutting. Some pictures. I encourage people to study the history of medicine. Giovanni Morgani starts to understand the effects of disease, as opposed to the early four humor system, and looking at what's the nature of the cause of disease. Better anatomy. William Harvey, as we mentioned earlier, with the discovery of circulation. All very interesting. The blood system, observation, and experiment. William Harvey is discovering circulation of the blood through the power of observation and experiment, and relatively till the scientific revolution, for thousands of years of history, this method of observation experiment wasn't very common. Edward Jenner, first vaccination, treats smallpox. On Jenner, more history of medicine, Florence Nightingale, all very interesting. Louis Pasteur, Robert Hooke, we discussed him earlier. I mean, this is more just the history of science, but this is important to understand the buildup for what is empiricism, what can we know, what can science tell us, what can science not tell us? My point is to show the soul, but just the background for the history of science, so we could know what science could actually tell us and what can't it tell us. And so when we try to answer these epistemological questions, like what is the soul, we know where science is not going to have answers. So, these are things that basically everyone living, if they haven't heard these names, these are groundbreaking things, 100 most important scientists' discoveries that are very important till today. Linnaeus, the classification of animals that we still use today, kingdom, phyla, species. Charles Darwin. So now we're coming into the beginnings of atheism, where because there's a lot of discovery, people have been thinking about things, people have been giving mechanistic understanding for not just physics with Newton, but at the same time in all sorts of fields. And this one's medicine and also geology and all the other types of sciences that weren't even mentioned as long. There's 240 some slides in this, and this is just part of the great progression of science. And then we have Darwin, who started out religious. He was had originally thought to become a priest in the Anglican Church, and comes up with evolution. And Darwin's thought had an incredible till Darwin. Really, there wasn't such a big effect on religious thought. People were mostly religious. Darwin himself had thought to become a priest. But now we start possibly giving answers to the question that science could never answer before, like, who am I? What am I here for? What's the purpose of life? And so now evolution is starting to provide non-spiritual, non-religious answers that never existed before. Darwin's theory of evolution is challenging Christian ideas, the value of human beings, man's made in God's image or just another animal, the purpose of human beings, part of God's plan versus accidental without purpose, the eternal future of human beings, eternal soul versus this life only. Different responses to Darwin. Christians start abandoning their faith. You start having industrialization, urbanization, had done much already to cut people's link to the churches. Humanism, supporting social Darwinism. A lot of Christians reject evolution, because it goes against the literal interpretation of Genesis, very similar to Galileo and the sun, the earth going around the sun, or the earth being the center. Although many Christians welcome and support evolution from the start and thought that there was some Christian message within it. And then you have social Darwinism. More at the same time, history of medicine. Gregory Mendel was a monk, and the idea of inheritance. Joseph Lister, like Listerine, cleanliness, chemicals. Robert Koch, German doctor. Growing cultures of germs. He identifies the bacteria causing tuberculosis. Chemistry, Robert Boyle. Lavoisier, you start discovering the elements. Conservation of mass, all these important laws, more and more powerful mechanistic understandings for how the material world operates. But notice that even though we keep on understanding the mechanistic material world better and better, that science is making absolutely no progress towards understanding the nature of the soul, the spiritual world, the purpose of man. Only this postulate of evolution comes close at all to giving any understanding of this. And even at that, it's hardly even science. That evolution is a theory, relatively is not really science compared to any of these other things we're talking about. Robert Boyle, more power of experiment. Chemistry, careful examination, experiment, measurements. Anyone who's taken chemistry, has dealt with the the preciseness of experiments and measurements and sizes and testing. So Boyle, the father of chemistry. Lavoisier, I think he's discoverer of oxygen. When we get into the chemical, the table of elements. Table of elements. Joseph Priestley, more chemistry, carbon dioxide, more elements. So I'm almost wrapping this up. So there's a lot to it, but it was important to get through this. Faraday we discussed, and science keeps on advancing. Scheele, green dye made up of copper and poisonous arsenic, 5 elements: chlorine, barium, manganese. The effects of scientific of the revolution, of the French Revolution, or the rich got richer, not much immediate change for peasants, widens an intellectual gap, effect on navigation, map making, artillery. Science has numerous social effects over time: bigger guns, bigger armies, more taxes, social discontent. Guns lead to European colonization, new ways of observing the world, church and science, increasing tension between science, rationality, and religion, faith. Most of the key science were religious men who did not try to take God out of the equation. Many people, though, believed that the new rationality science that took God out of the equation, this was seen as frightening by many. Response by the church: banned books, label certain scientific ideas heresy. Response by others was try to withdraw the philosophical connection between science and religion. People like me who are deeply religious and deeply scientific, but this conflict grows. Most scientists do not want to challenge the role of Christianity. Church explained the world through inspiration, revealed truth. Science explained the world through logical reasoning. The church hailed reason as the enemy of faith, but eventually began to embrace some of the achievements of the scientific revolution. Laws discovered by human reason despiritualized and demystified the universe. Mechanical view of the universe, deistic view of God. God is the cosmic capitalist. View of nature as a machine. Nature is a matter in motion, governed by unchanging laws. Knowledge of these laws, ability to use nature. Bacon, God is the watchmaker. A whole new world. The Royal Society of London, the Academy of Royal Societies in France, scientific method. In the Enlightenment, the heart of the Enlightenment is the application of reason to all aspects of life, applied scientific method to other aspects of the human condition. The age of reason, people were encouraged to shake off the thinking of the past and the superstition of the religious-based answers, was a search for the natural laws that govern human interaction, culmination of the four intellectual developments, popularization of science, skepticism about religion, knowledge about cultures outside of Europe, and the work of Newton and Locke. Path to Enlightenment, popularization of science. 17th century authors popularized the work on top scientists by translating it to language that average intelligent people can understand. Theories of Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, widely known. Religious skepticism, Reformation disputes caused growing cynicism towards structured religion. Scientific discovery led some to believe that the answers could be found outside of the blind faith of the church. Travel reports, Locke and Newton. Orderly, rational universe based on natural laws had a profound effect on intellectuals. Increasingly, thinkers began to search for ways to apply natural laws to other things. Locke developed a theory of knowledge based on the idea that all people are born blank states. Everything that people know and believe is based on experience and exposure. Can create better people by providing better environment, improve society so that there's a better environment for shaping people. Wow, that was a good one. I think I got 11 people watching. I'll put the link in the chat again if people want to join. I got 4 more of these, and that one was the longest. Actually, I got 5 more of these. Some of these are short, and just read some of these chats. So yeah, I really did want to cover this. Just that one was more the history of science. So so I started with the ancient Greeks, and we're talking about Aristotle and Plato and all that, and how that reason had been implied to the soul into understanding God. And in the same reason, most of these scientists up until the modern era are deeply religious people. A lot of them are working for the church. A lot of them are priests. A lot of them spend time with all different types of intellectual endeavors on what's the nature of the soul and God, and a lot of them interpret scripture. And then there starts to become this schism between science and religion as science could start explaining a better and better mechanistic understanding of the world. Evolution would be the only thing that appears to start answering what religion had always answered. So, I mean, until evolution comes around, there's really no conflict between Oswald. I will be discussing Spinoza soon. Like, I started with the Greeks, and this one was the history of science. This long one I did was just the history of science. And Spinoza is more philosophy than science. Although I did mention Spinoza, Spinoza was kind of similar to the ancient Greek school that held that everything is one, that there was no separation between material and spirit, mind, and body. How are we going to create the brotherhood of man? And saying this is extremely important. I want to increase the intellectual content of these conversations. And there's only 10 people watching, but a lot of you people are on different streams and saying like this is very important information. Saying I'm a scientist, I'm a religious man, I'm a Hasidic Jew, but I'm an engineer. I know advanced calculus and mathematics, and I study physics, and I'm constantly studying science. And it's important to understand this, and so that you really know what science answers and what it doesn't answer. And why evolution I thought was so degenerate in nature. Like I encourage people to be religious and devout and to believe in our scripture. However, I also encourage people to be scientists and use the scientific method and try to understand the material world and to apply rational and scientific thought to trying to understand the soul and the nature of God. And that's why I say evolution is an extremely weak thought, weak theory that is trying to conflict and explain the answer to these questions with an alternative theory. That was my purpose in the debate on JF, to show how weak the theory of evolution is. And now, so I'm just giving the nature, what is science, what is empiricism, what is thought. And I'll put the link in the chat if anyone wants to, add a voice in so people aren't just hearing me talk. I'll take a breather to take a little bit more carrot juice, and I'm going to continue. I got more slides. So, relatively, I'm probably about halfway done. It's been a little more than an hour, so I probably got another hour left. And as I don't know, we're going to debunk evolution, but saying like you shouldn't feel embarrassed to be a believer. You're saying be a rationalist person who believes in science and logic and empiricism, who rejects evolution and also believes in scripture. And if you're a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, or whatever, and saying that is more logical than evolution. So this is going to be pure autism. Like I want to just provide up the intellectual content of people, and maybe people who saw me on JF and they come to my channel and they'll see this and see more high quality thought on this issue. And saying my thought doesn't really matter, and so that's why I just want to present this information. I'm trying to condense thousands and thousands of years of history and the greatest minds into a few hour presentation. And I took the greatest wisdom out of these are basically undergraduate college courses on these topics that I took from. So I sent Babs the link if he wants. Someone wants to join in. The link's in the chat. And but let's just talk about the. I want to cover a lot of materials. So if the people are still up, we'll talk about other things first. But that link should be working. It says it's working. So whatever the case, I'm going to go back to presenting. If you join in, you just chime in and I'll hear you. But let's stick to the thoughts. So let me start with a shorter one. So that we're more than halfway done, but Okay, so let's go back to these further proofs of God that we discussed earlier. So we had, God is omnipotent, one, having unlimited power and authority, omniscient, knowing everything that can be known, and omnipresent, meaning the state of being everywhere at once. We had the arguments for God's existence, the ontological, cosmological, that Thomas Aquinas had 5 different forms of the cosmological argument, the theological argument, and Kant the moral argument. People who know basic logic, ontological arguments, St. Anselm's, and the argument for God's existence of one, that God doesn't depend on the premises that are grounded in experience. So central to Anselm's argument is a distinction between 2 kinds of existence. For a thing to exist in reality is for it to be part of reality to really exist. For a thing to exist in understanding is for something to have an idea of that thing. If so, therefore, if you could think of God, God must exist. So, I mean, if you think about it, it seems kind of simple, but relatively it's pretty deep. Further outline. Suppose you could conceive of God's non-existence, then you could think of something greater than God, something just like God but existing. God is a being which there's none greater can be conceived, but nothing can be conceived as greater than God, so God's non-existence is inconceivable. Simple argument. Another way to put it, Anselm defines God as a perfect being. Perfect being must have all perfections, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must have existence. God must exist. To deny it is self-contradictory. It would be like saying triangles have 3 sides by definition, but there's a triangle which has only 2 sides. So, it's kind of just like an imperative that God exists. Anselm is just saying it's imperative. It has to be that God exists. Just think about it for a few seconds. There has to be some perfect being. There has to be a being which nothing could be higher than. That being has to be God. And so it's what they call in logic a reductio ad absurdum. It offers a proof that God exists by assuming that God does not exist, and then arguing that that's an absurdity, meaning that we must reject the opposite. Therefore, the other is true. If it's absurd to think that God doesn't exist, then God must exist. There's objections to it. There are various classical objections to the classical argument. In Anselm's own time, there was a monk who offered Gonilio's objection. Said you could define the perfect island as the island that which none is greater can be conceived. Then by the same reasoning, we could prove the existence of such an island, but this is absurd, so there must be some fault in Anselm's reasoning. Possible reply, the perfect island, unlike God, can't be conceived to exist in reality. For any island we think of, we can think of a greater island. The perfect island is like the greatest number. So maybe Gonilio's objection is not really an objection. Is God really different in this respect? Perhaps the idea that God is an infinite being is relevant here. And, hence when we come into later Cantor and set theory, and Galileo had worked on set theory. But these are important. Immanuel Kant gives an objection to Anselm's argument. The existence is not a predicate. The predicate of the argument is the word of phrase whose function is to attribute a property to things. The predicate, red, for example, is the property of redness. When we say things exist, claim Kant, we do not attribute it to a new property. In addition, it's other properties. According to Anselm, if God did not exist, then he would lack a property existence that contributes to greatness. But Kant says this makes no sense because existence is not a property like redness that a thing can either have or lack. So, very interesting. I encourage people to look more into this. So, cosmological argument, they would look at Pascal's wager. We'll talk about it later. What's more important, saying maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't, but the consequence of there not being a God is much less than the consequence of there being a God. Therefore, we should side to there being a God. You would St. Thomas Aquinas, the cosmological arguments, everything that exists must have a cause. Therefore, there must be a first cause, and that third cause must be God. Here it's divided into like 8 prong arguments. of a logical premise. The universe exists, everything exists as a cause. Causes precede their effects. The chains of cause and effect cannot go back in time infinitely. Therefore, there must be a first cause that is not itself an effect. Since everything has a cause, the first cause must be the cause of itself. The self-cause first cause is God, therefore God exists. Flaws. Is it conceivable that the chain of cause and effect extends back infinitely? Is it based on the assumption that everything has a cause? Maybe everything doesn't have a cause. And the first cause is God. If there's a first cause of God, what caused God? If one accepts the idea of a first cause, it can be argued that the universe may have always existed, and the regress could end with the necessary existence of the universe. It need not posit that God is the first cause. There are arguments to St. Thomas Aquinas's cosmological arguments. There's variations on the cosmological argument. Pascal, so you say there's uncertainty in the matter. Pascal, obviously the computer programming language of Pascal. Pascal had invented famous the Pascal triangles and early forms of computer logic. So let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then without hesitation that he is, saying if there's not a God and you think that there is a God, what's the big deal? And if there is a God and you think that there isn't a God, that could be a really big deal. One does not know whether God exists. Not believing in God is bad for one's eternal soul. If God does exist, believing God is of no consequence if God does not exist. Therefore, it is one's interest to believe in God. And here, is a nice little chart on the wager of God exists, wager on agnostic skepticism. God exists, and rewards. Okay, so I encourage people to look at it. If people are interested, they could pause it and study this chart. Theological argument. Design purpose. The complexity of life on Earth and the harmonious organization of the living organism exhibits evidence of intelligent design. A design necessitates the presence of a designer. That designer is God. William Paley, we had talked about in the last lecture with the intelligent watchmaker. Complexity and efficiency of natural objects like the eye, the brain, are evidence that they must have been purposely designed. How else could they have come to be as they are, perfectly adapted for the purpose that they serve? Critics. David Hume, critic of Paley. It assumes without justification that there is a significant resemblance between objects which occur naturally, like the eye, and those which have been designed by humans, like the watch. Is there a strong similarity between the two, sufficient to make the analogy strong? Hume argued that we cannot infer from the fact that these examples of order in our universe have human causes, like the watch, that the universe as a whole has a cause and has been designed because the universe is unique. Therefore, because the universe is unique, we cannot rely on the analogy to explain it. And the similar argument to the cosmological: if the universe was designed, who designed the designer? The argument of design tells us little about God, except God is a design producing being. The argument does not allow us to draw any conclusions as to God's nature or character beyond that. And then we have Darwin coming. Scientific theory for how complex life develops without the need for a designer. Process of survival of the fittest explains how adaptations to environment have occurred without needing to introduce the notion of God. You have Kant's moral argument, argue that a man must assume the existence of God in life after death if he is to make sense of his desire for happiness and his moral duty. Believe that the uniting of man's desire for happiness with man's moral duty could not occur in this life or without God's power. Therefore, it is moral necessity to assume God's existence. It is rational to be moral only if it's rewarded. That doesn't happen in this life. It must happen in another life. Therefore, there must be an afterlife and a God. Here's the formal, logical form of the argument. Morality consists of a set of commands. For every command, there's a commander. Therefore, there's a commander that commanded morality. Commands only carry as much authority as their commander. Morality carries ultimate authority. Therefore, the commander that commanded morality carries ultimate authority. Only God carries ultimate authority. Therefore, the commander that commanded morality is God. Therefore, God exists. In perfection of the moral argument, we ought to be morally perfect. If we ought to be morally perfect, then we can be morally perfect. We cannot be morally perfect unless God exists, therefore God exists. It takes the fact that there's a gap between our moral duties and what we are capable of doing to imply the existence of God. We cannot achieve moral perfection by our own strength, but we can do so with God's help, which is available to us. God can forgive us. God can take the punishment for our sins. God can restore us to righteousness. Or the evil, so if there's a God, what about evil? The Epicurean Trilemma, God is all good, all powerful, and yet there's still good. There's still evil. There's moral evil deliberately caused by humans, like cruelty, natural evil, things which happen accidentally, like earthquakes and flood. Many people think the existence of evil and suffering in the world show that there is no God, or if God exists, is unkind. So here's the form of it. God exists. He is all good, all knowing, all powerful. If he is all good, he is willing to prevent evil. If he's all knowing, he knows how to prevent it. If he's all powerful, he can prevent it, but evil exists, so therefore God does not exist. This is the Epicurean Trilemma that was used to weaken the power of the Greek gods. Okay, this is from a university book, university course, so there's some of, you bring Dawkins, so there's some of the, just coursework that was recommended. Okay, I'm not sure if Babs is joining or not. I'll put the link in the chat one more time and keep on going. Take a little carrot juice. It's 4th of July here, so you can hear the fireworks in the background. Okay. I'd mentioned Leibniz. We just talked about the Epicurean Trilemma and Leibniz's answer with the best of all possible worlds and the calculus trying to understand this trilemma. So let's talk about Leibniz, monism, and best of all possible worlds. I don't know if this prayer comes from Leibniz himself. He was a devout Christian. Leibniz tries to logically deduce and prove that a person should surrender to Jesus Christ. Some biographical data about Leibniz. He was Lutheran. He was Germany, but I guess part of that may have been under control of France, or he's French speaking. His father was a professor of moral philosophy in Leipzig. He studied law, declined professorship, served as a librarian, judge, minister, mostly for royalty. I've been reading a book. You could see his letters back and forth to different aristocrats and royals. Mathematics, independently developed differential and integral calculus at the same time as Newton, devising a superior notation like dx and dy that's still used today, a binary number system, a lot of stuff. People could look up his biography. He anticipated Einstein by arguing against Newton. He developed a new classical theory of motion based on kinetic and potential energy called dynamics that's still popular today, where we have kinetic motion and potential energy, and they're always at a balance, that things switch back and forth between potential and kinetic. He was an engineer, windmills, lamps, submarines, clock, hydraulic presses, desalination of water. He worked for the reunification of the church, Lutherans, Catholics, Calvinists, and Anglicans. He wanted to unify the church. He had the principle of sufficient reason. There is an adequate reason to account for the existence and nature of everything. Things just don't happen. A theory of material reality based on monads. A monad is an indestructible point with a soul-like quality of perception, appetite, synchronized by God. All objects in the material world are collections of monads, similar to atomism, or like Freeman Dyson, and saying that atoms have consciousness. Still popular today, as physicists can't really explain this. Theory of knowledge suggests there is an existence and analogy between our ideas and God's, and an identity between our logic and God's. He opposed John Locke's theory that the human mind is a blank tablet at birth and that we gain knowledge only through the senses. The problem of evil was the subject of his first book, the Theodicy. So there's three different versions of the theory of evil. All powerful, all knowing, all good, and all loving God exist. Evil exists. Extreme and horrendous evil exists. Gratitude and pointless evil exist. Gratuitous. So Augustine's explanation that the present world is not what God intended. The original sin of Adam and Eve corrupted human nature. The corrupted nature of the guilty, the original sin, is inherited by the descendants of Adam and Eve. We sin and cause moral evil. The presence of natural evil in the world is the punishment for original sin. Pretty common theology. Probably a lot of you have heard of this. Leibniz suggests God has specific good purpose for that God wished to fulfill in creating the world. This present world is the best of all possible worlds that meets God's goods and purposes. Evil is tolerated or permitted by God only because it is a necessary consequence, a side effect of creating the best possible world that meets all of God's good purposes. Very deep stuff. Leave it here for a second. Hope you have time to digest this and look back at this. Really, Leibniz here, this was part of the heart of really what I wanted to discuss. Leibniz suggests that this could be the best of all possible worlds, was ridiculed by Voltaire and other Enlightenment intellectuals. An all-powerful God really do. God is all-powerful. How is this the best possible of all worlds? What does it mean when we say God is all-powerful, but yet there's such a thing as the best possible of worlds? So we have to, what was God's purpose in creating the universe? How might fulfilling such a purpose include the necessary consequences, side effects of evil? So what do we mean when we say God is all-powerful, omnipotent? God can do anything. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? Could God create a square circle, and so on and so on? Some things are intrinsically impossible, that even though the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God can't do the impossible. Can God create something that God cannot destroy? So on and so on. These incredible paradoxes. Can God make a square with three sides? Change the... So all-powerful means that God can do any conceivable action and produce any conceivable thing or arrangement of things, so as long as the action or thing is logically possible, so long as the action or thing is consistent with the rest of nature of God, unembodied, all good, all loving, and all knowing. So he's saying God is confined, so to say, by the rules of the universe, the rules of logic, the rules of materialism, such that this could be the best of all possible perfect worlds within the confines of certain realities that maybe God himself created. Omniscience does not mean anything goes, or nothing is impossible for God. If action A logically or necessarily results in action B occurring, then not even God could do A without B. If you choose to make a tire with a softer rubber that grips the road better, as necessary follows that tire will wear faster than a tire made with a hard rubber that will not grip the road as well. If God chose to design a tire and agreed to play by the same rules as human engineers, the God-given laws of physics and chemistry, God would be subject to the same trade-off of grip versus wear. So God's purpose in creation. Is there a best possible world? God's goodness would oblige God to create the best possible world. But is there a best possible world? What if the set of possible good worlds is an infinite continuum of increasing goodness, so that there is no best world any more than there is a highest number? Jesuit scholastics of Leibniz' time believed this was the case. God therefore simply arbitrarily chose to bring about one among the range of morally acceptable worlds. Leibniz rejected the idea God's choice of what possible world to create could be arbitrary or a roll of the dice. Nothing just happens. There must be a sufficient reason for anything, even God's choices. It's the principle of sufficient reason. God must have had reasons and purposes for choosing to create a world that God created. Out of all the possible worlds that might fulfill God's reason and purpose for creation, God's goodness would oblige God to actualize only the best one of the possible worlds. But what is God trying to do in creation? What are God's criteria for judging the best Leibniz suggested the best world is one that maximizes the virtue of the free, rational, sentient beings. There are many facets to God's goodness and splendor, and a finite created thing or creature could only mirror a limited part of the goodness and splendor. The best world is one that maximizes the mirroring of God's goodness and splendor in the creation through a vast variety of things and creatures. The best world is one which yields the greatest variety of phenomena governed by the simplest, most elegant, most beautiful set of laws. So evil in the best possible world. How can there be evil in the best possible world? Example, consider these goals in designing the best tire: maximum durability, traction in snow, rain, dry pavement. There are trade-offs. So one might say the final product necessarily must include some degree of evil that falls out of the trade-offs that compromise the design. If action A logically, here. So Leibniz suggests was one of the following consequences, side effects involving the design of the world that maximizes the virtue of free, rational, sentient beings, maximizes the mirroring God's goodness and splendor in the creation through a vast variety of things and creatures, and yields the greatest variety of phenomenon governed by the simplest, most elegant, most beautiful set of laws. God remains holy in permitting this evil because it is a necessary consequence of God performing God's obligation to create the best possible world that fulfills God's good and purpose for creation. Awesome. Leibniz, if you heard that Leibniz part, it was worth that you were here and paying attention. That was really, the Kabbalists say similar things, and we're finishing through only 3 presentations left, and the rest are going to come to like, what is science, what is empiricism, what is logic, what can we really know about truth. So I'm glad that all you people are here, got to hear Leibniz. Yes, so John, everything I'm saying here tonight is basically Greeks in Europe. And I didn't, besides Spinoza, which was hardly mentioned, almost no. The only thing Jewish tonight is the fact that it's on my channel, and I'm the one teaching you this European stuff. I could, the Kabbalists and the Hebraicists in general were more straight on scripture and less philosophical, and even like duties of the heart, where we did suggest a lot of this stuff. And the path of the righteous, the Rabbi Luzzatto has similar ideas. A lot of it was probably taken from European thinkers. So, no problem at all with learning from the great scholars of the West. I encourage you to do it. That's why I told JF in praise of the French, the French thinkers. Like I said, Leibniz was French, although maybe he, Germanic, but I do think he had a French connection. So let's continue. I'm enjoying doing this. We're an hour 45 minutes. Might be able to finish in 20 minutes. So what I introduction to social science from philosophy via history to sociology. This is from the University of Copenhagen. This one's short, and this philosophy is science. And so it's like, what does science actually teach us? What can we actually know from science, as opposed to theology and understanding the mechanistic nature of the material world that's not going to answer these spiritual questions. So like, what is science? The philosophy of science, the human being's a thinking animal. Like Socrates said, to think is also to ponder is to self-reflect. Why do I do what I do? Do I do it the right way? Is it good for me and others? Could it be better? Your research, it's fun. It makes me understand the world better. I can make a living from it, perhaps a career. I can give back to society. It's worth the effort for its own sake. What is research? Humankind's hope for survival. These questions all have serious implications in philosophy, and hence little overview of the philosophy of science. So history of the philosophy of science, we had Plato and Pythagorean that we mentioned before. Science equals knowledge, the harmony, insight into the fundamental structure of the universe. Galileo, the book of nature stands open to our gaze, yet we have to understand its language and mathematics. Pythagorean, the rival view of Geminus, mathematical hypothesis, physical theories about the structure of the universe. distinguishes between explaining phenomenon. Ptolemy, more than one model can be constructive to save the appearance of planetary motion. A moving eccentric model may be equivalent to a Pictorial differential system. Ptolemy had the best model of the universe with the epicycles and the Earth in the center. Before the 19th century, there is no clear distinction between scientists and philosophers of science. Philosophical issues was discussed by scientists having different ideals of science. You had realism, science aims at making true theories about the structure of the world, versus instrumentalism, science aims at making models useful to account for observations and predictions. Inductivism, knowledge from observation, versus hypothetical deductive views of science. The competing Platonic, Pythagorean, the Aristotelian, the Archimedean, mechanistic understanding. Positivism, Rudolf Carnap, I never heard of him before this, as far as I know. Comte, heard of him. System builders, philosophical, emergence of self-conscious scientific spirit. Skepticism regarding armchair philosophy. You want precise, distancing the vague and opaque and contemporary philosophy. Edifying philosophy should be held, built up, not break down. Positive philosophy, the idea of enlightenment and beliefs in progress. He's a founder of sociology, systems building, progressive philosophy of history, the theological state, belief in supernatural powers, animism, polytheism, monotheism, the metaphysical stage before abstract powers, isolated speculation, branches of philosophy, philosophical systems to the scientific stage, belief in invariant patterns, scientific matter of fact, fewer and fewer more general facts. Logical positivism, Ernest Mach, the goal which is physical science has set itself as the simplest and most economical abstract expression of facts. Mach held that scientific laws are summaries of experimental events constructed for the purpose of human comprehension of complex data. Thus, scientific laws have more to do with the mind than with reality as it exists apart from the mind. So, great logical positivists. Anyone familiar with these? Wittgenstein, the Jew. Source of knowledge, observation plus logic, logical empiricism, like we had from Newton, combining Descartes and Locke. Language has logical structure. What is meaningful, what is verifiable by implications, metaphysics is considered as meaningless, a mirroring relation between languages and reality. So you have induction from data and facts and observation to laws and theories. In laws and theories, you could deduce predictions and explanations. Construction of general knowledge through induction and deduction, the hypothetical deductive method. Universal unified science. Mathematical physics becomes the ideal science. Theory, reduction, logical analysis are seen as tools for unified science. Analytical. Verification of theory through meaning. The language of observation and the language of theory are seen as sharply separated. From what we actually observe, you could look possibly similar to Plato's cave. Logical positivism, analytic synthetic distinction. All math and logic are seen as analytic, making possible to treat mathematical knowledge within an empiricist frame. Kant, geometry, discovery, non-Euclidean geometry. Einstein, two kinds of geometry, analytic and synthetic. Verification, theory of meaning. The language of observation and the language of theory are seen as sharply segregated. Logic is a main tool for philosophy. Deductive logic is a guarantee of truth, but what about inductive logic? It became important to develop an inductive logic. Carnap did great work, but ultimately failed. Context of discovery versus context of justification. Philosophy takes care of justification, while history and psychology studies discovery. Implied a theological picture of the scientific method as intrinsically goal-directed towards objective knowledge, with an asymmetry between explanations of good and bad science. Only bad science, pseudoscience, needs external historical or psychological explanations. Science should be face value, emphasis on facts and the objectivity of science. Objectivity conceived as methods to secure mirror-like relation between theories and observations. Methodological reductionism, theory reduction. Ontological reductionism, physicalism, the belief that the world is ultimately physically nature. Eventual phenomenalism, says Mach, sense impressions are the ultimate stuff of all knowledge. In some context, positive is used to express in criticism or disapproval. Do you think that the social science should only contribute knowledge to form or basis of a piecemeal social engineering, the Karl Popper, sociology reduced to quantitative statistics? So we were getting to what we call the hard sciences and light sciences, and even moving from mathematical physics as the ideal science to anatomy and physics and medicine, to lighter than the pure, beauty of the mathematical physics, into things like evolution, which are very weak science, to things like sociology and psychology, which imply empiricism, logic, and the scientific method, but are nowhere near the means of physics and mathematical science. So science is the highest form of cultural human activity. Science aims at positive, certain understanding by means of the scientific method, hypothetical, deductive, theory testing, falsification. Science is or should be autonomous, only guided by curiosity and the interdevelopmental logic of each specificity. Knowledge is justified true beliefs. Truth is epistemic, not ontological, about being, or axiological, about values or concept. Knowledge is neutral regarding use or misuse. There is no ethically wrong or irresponsible knowledge, only knowledge used wrongly in specific situation. There is or should be a sharp division between science and non-science, like politics and religion. Use misuse is a political question. If a researcher asserts anything about this, it is in his or her role not as a researcher, but as a citizen, a layperson, a politician. Natural science is only committed to search for true knowledge, not good knowledge. Science forms the basis for technology that can be applied to acceptable or intolerable purposes, but the ethics and politics involved in this is foreign to science. Very important to separate the two. Positivistic ethos of science, the exact wording of the ethos in the slide above is from the professor here. According to Merton, the ethos of science can be expressed into norms. Communism, knowledge is a common good. Universality, science is for all, disregarding social, political, religious background. Disinterestedness, objectivity, organized skepticism, the system of critical testing evaluation. So here, slide we had earlier, some notes. Here we had Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, great book. I've read a lot of Kuhn's works, heard him mention. Kuhn focused on science as a micro-social historical process, questioning the continuity view of theories as conceptual structures embedded in historically situated social frameworks, paradigms, questioning the community and cumulative nature of knowledge, revolutions, context of discovery and context of justification is not so neatly separated. The paradigm frames beforehand how to ask questions, how to interpret the discovery. Thus, he sets out to understand the context of normal science practiced on a deeper level. History of philosophical science, Kuhn's scheme of scientific developments, pre-paradigmatic science, the normal science, puzzle-solving, crisis if some anomaly is too serious, revolution, and you have a new normative science. Contrast to positivism and Popper, the development of science is not trivial or cumulative, but discontinuous. Anomalies is part of normal science. Scientific development is the question of not only theory, but also social factors and values. Science is not foreign to values, even data and theory laden, and is thus connected to the wider conceptual scheme that a paradigm constitute. No definition, demarcation criterion. Science, the concept of cluster of family likeness. So consider Kuhn the Jew, understanding of science versus, we had Popper and the positivistic, more Germanic understanding of science. So Kuhn is the founder of the history and philosophical science. Kuhn is an internalist, the social as a set of factors influencing science is mainly of an intellectual character and mainly manifest within the development of paradigm and especially in between paradigms. Kuhn is an externalist regarding the phases of crisis and extraordinary science between two rival paradigms. Here, social factors external to science may play a role in the process of science. Kuhn's a relativist, yes, but not an irrationalist. The process of theory choice is not irrational, yet it is not following any special algorithm or predefined set of methodological norms independent of any paradigm. So Kuhn's critique of positivism, he contested some elements of a positivistic ethos of science. Science aims at a positive certain knowledge by means of the scientific method, hypothetical, deductive, theory testing, falsification, but was more critical to positivism as a philosophy than as an ethos or the ethos implication for science policy. So what is the history and science and philosophy of science tradition? Study science in context. Science is a human activity and not purely logical theoretical process. To know about scientific change, one must look at how much science was actually conducted. Philosophy is not enough. History of science provides important sources for analyzing philosophical issues like confirmation, justification, theory choice, discoveries, controversies, etc. Thus, Kuhn's impact on the turn of transformation of classical logicist philosophy of science into an integrated study of the history and philosophy of scientific development, the HBS tradition. The history of science without philosophy of science is blind, and philosophy of science without history of science is empty. Kuhn's legacy. Kuhn, the revolutionary, a relativist himself, questioned the objectivity of science and the inevitable nature of scientific progress. His own theory seemed like a revolution in positivist philosophy of science. Kuhn, the conservative, he distanced himself from the more philosophically radical interpretations of his work, and we can see as a conservative regarding the implications for science policy. Society should not interfere with the everyday workings of science, and a certain amount of indoctrination in the normal science education of science seems necessary. More recently, the sociology of science and technology studies have become popular topics, and a few HBS departments have become science studies departments. The School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of New South Wales was known as the School of Science and Technology Studies from the mid-80s till 2001. For this reason, it could be argued that the fields are identical and that the difference is only one of emphasis. While it may seem that the STS is a broader concept, leaving room for other approaches to science, such as sociology of science, HBS departments are not usually as exclusive as a literal interpretation of the name might imply. So, Society of Scientific Knowledge, Barnes and Bohr. You must give sociological explanations for erroneous as well as true beliefs. They should be treated systematically. Collins, the Sociology of Scientific Experiments and Forms of Expertise. Study of how social, political, and cultural values affect scientific research and technological innovation, and how these in turn affect society, politics, and cultural, an interest in viewing science and technology as socially embedded enterprises, an interest in studying relationships between techno-scientific innovations in society from new perspectives, anthropology, but also literature, history, cultural studies, gender studies, history of consciousness, medicine, law, and computer science, concern over the direct and risk of science and technology. So this science and technology studies includes studies the pathway from research to technology and invoices the accompanying instrumentation of science and the risk and uncertainties involved. The study of how political and cultural values affect scientific research and technology innovation, and how these in turn affect science, politics, and culture. Okay. 2 down. Still got 10 people here. Awesome. I'm down to 8. Next? Take a carrot break.
All right, I'll talk in the meantime.
Got Jakey Jake Shrink, James, Manny P. Hall. I have Manny P. Hall on my shelf here. Great teaching. Secret teaching is all ages. Freemasonry. Good stuff.
Yeah, that's again sort of like Freemasonic for
millennials. A good way to continue. So, God give me the strength. I'm going to finish up strong. Been at this almost 2 hours. Only 2 slideshows left. So, John Harris, going back to the last presentation, what is the relationship between omnipotence and miracles? I don't think Leibniz mentioned that in his slides, and the best of all possible worlds, and so I still do believe in miracles, and miracles could happen. And saying God is all powerful and could break the material laws, although certain there's different ways of understanding the best of all possible worlds, and Leibniz's understanding versus Kabbalistical understandings. I don't know if Babs is in here.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Let me see. I have Babs.
Hello. 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 Can you hear me? Type in yes in the chat if you can hear me.
Are you here, Babs?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Hello. Are you here, Babs?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I didn't have my headphone in. How long have you been here?
Quite a while, actually.
Have you said anything?
Yes. I was wondering why you were ignoring me.
Yeah, I didn't have my headphone in because, just
Yeah, no. Freemason / perennialist, kind of Guinonian type vein of stuff has always intrigued me. Manly P. Hall.
Yeah, because Masonry was largely scientific. I'm saying, obviously, up until the modern era, almost all famous scientists were Freemasons, like Newton, Leibniz, Laplace, Lagrange, Benjamin Franklin, Faraday, Maxwell. They were all part of the Royal Society and Freemasons, and so largely Freemasonry has became more esoteric and less scientific, and sciences became less spiritual. So there has to be, I'd like to see some sort of revival of Freemasonry that would try to breach the gap of the spiritualism and scientific worlds. Yeah, I was switching between.
Yeah, I would like to see something similar as well. In some ways. Also, I would like to ask you, which arguments of these, from your own personal standpoint, appeals to you or makes sense to you in terms of your understanding and comprehension of the divine, or which one of them also makes sense more from like a, let's say, sort of rabbinical, current status quo, mainstream Judaic perspective? Do you think you can
from the
answer
scientific perspective, it doesn't matter what I think or how I feel. I'm saying I should go with the facts. And you could look at, so I'm going to come on to.
Why are you reading these arguments? I'm curious. I didn't get the full context.
Well, I just want, in terms of my debate with JF, and I was saying just is why I claim it. I said it's just as logical to believe in the soul and God as it is in evolution, or even more so. So I wanted to know, first of all, the logical arguments for the soul, how to take a logical, rationalistic approach to spirituality and religion, the history of religion, the history of science, the history of philosophy, how most scientists and philosophers throughout the ages were religious in nature, where the break comes from science and religion, what science actually tells us and what science doesn't tell us, and what is the empirical scientific method, and how can that apply to like the true beauty of the father of all sciences, mathematical physics, and relatively like biology, chemistry is only as good as it could be reduced to differential equations and mathematical physics. And so can you do that with spirituality? To some extent, no, you can't really reduce spirituality to the engineering in the same way that you could almost exactly define with mathematical equations properties for engineering. It's hard to do that with the soul and religion. However, the same logical empiricistic methods that we use to investigate truth are used with religion and used with spiritual endeavors. And saying something like evolution is a soft science, just like sociology, psychology are soft sciences, in the same way that your religion, the soul, esotericism, they're not non-scientific. They're soft sciences. They're soft science like sociology or psychology, or possibly even forms of biology.
What would you consider a hard science? Math?
I mean, really only engineering, mathematical physics. The only thing that's a hard science is when you could produce physical laws into exact mathematical equations that will exactly mechanistically tell you how the world operates in a predictable way, where here's the formula, here's the physical reality, and you could put it into like a combustion engine in your car or something. Basically exactly when you put the gas in your car and your car drives, every component of your automobile could be reduced into physical mathematical equations that exactly explain everything that's being done, how it could be designed and tested, modeled, and so on and so on. So,
and what are your thoughts on people who discuss this sort of like the breakdown of physics on the subatomic level and use that as proof?
Well, that's what I'm not going to be able to get into all this stuff, and a lot of stuff is like takes lifetimes of research.
I think that's an interesting argument, though. I've heard it made several times.
Well, that's what Leibniz said in his theory of monads, which really
precisely. I saw you talking about that earlier, and I think that is a good argument.
And Freeman Dyson said that the atoms have consciousness, and even modern physicists think that there might be a consciousness level. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle or chaos, and there's some sort of even the spiritualist has said the levels of the soul, and even inanimate objects have a soul, so that the ancient philosophers didn't have mechanistic science in the same way we have today, but they had used science and empiricism and logic to try to deduce these type things. And so when the ancients debated, does a rock have a soul or not? And so these debates are still applicable till today.
Yeah, and this leads us also sort of towards panpsychism, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts
on. I'm not an expert on that, and that's so there's different theories. I'd like to do maybe another presentation on the present understandings of consciousness, which I'm not going to have time at all to get to tonight, no chance. And I didn't prepare the slides. Like I spent a few hours searching for good slideshows, university or different people who had PowerPoints presentations out here to go through for tonight. And I would like to do that, although tonight, I wanted to, directly relative to response to people in the chat of JF's debate or questions that people asked during JF or that JF asked me. And I was like, I wasn't prepared. I came then just to argue the negative of evolution and not to argue the positive of the soul or spirituality. But I did, strongly say I'm a scientist and I approach religion and spirituality from a scientific perspective. And it's saying that certain questions you can't answer. You just have to give the best possible hypothesis that's possible with the evidence and experiments that we can conduct. And just because we don't have perfect answers like we might for like combustion or like the Carnot cycle, that we could still use these logical endeavors to do that. And if I, time, all these things are interesting and worthy of research. So the philosophy of science, what is science, the history of science, how the earliest scientists you looked at the spiritual matter. That's the main thing I wanted to cover. And I have two last presentations on epistemology, theory of knowledge, and scientific ways of knowing. 150 and 80 slides, probably take 20 minutes. I'm not sure if you want to go through those. I'll re-enter presentation.
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay.
Or if you do want to change things up quickly, I would like to hear, because I'm halfway through watching your appearance on the stream, roughly, perhaps a little bit less than that. And I've sort of been not really taking a break from online activity for the last week or so, a little bit more. But I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts on the stream coming at it just from an overall angle? What are your thoughts on like how do you feel coming away from it emotionally? How do you feel about the arguments you went up against? How do you feel about the audience and some of the comments and the super chats? Like, what are your thoughts overall?
I felt, because I did a lot of research. Like, I've been studying this my whole life, but I did like 20 hours of research for that. And he didn't want to choreograph it or map it out. So I didn't know, what he was going to say. So I kind of just had to study everything. And I prepared, went over some of the best arguments against evolution with a strong focus on consciousness, because I really wanted to discuss consciousness, because I'm not a biologist or a geneticist, and that's not my area of expertise. So I wanted to focus more on the hard problem of consciousness, and then go over some of the, at least voice some of the strongest objections scientifically to evolution, and then the other topic of degeneracy. So I felt pretty satisfied with my appearance going through. Like, there are a lot of things I could have known better, and so if the debate had been more scripted, I would have been more factual. But unfortunately, it was 3 hours, and I had no idea, the way the arguments were going to form. I didn't really have any notes. It was the first time I'd really publicly said over these arguments, and also, so if it's something I've been talking about and came out of my mouth many times before, it would have came out smoother and clearer, and it would, names and dates more accurately. But relatively, I'm pretty satisfied. It looks like it's still getting a few hundred views a day. It might break 13,000 views. I'm not sure if he's going to have me back this Tuesday or not, or what we're going to talk about. And if we do talk about something related to this, I want to have my research ready, saying, that I'm going to do my homework, and that, that I'm going to, be able to present something, and also that I'm presenting basically Western tradition. So even though obviously I'm a Hasidic Jew, I'm not arguing to a fellow Jewish audience. I'm arguing to a largely, alt-right, Western, pro-Western audience. So I'm arguing from the best of the Western sages. I thought that was an important factor to, be arguing from their own sages as opposed to my sages. You know what I'm saying? Did I lose you there?
Yeah, of course. Speak different. No. Of course, speak different.
You're saying like I wasn't
speak
quoting
to
the
people in
Talmud.
their own language, because otherwise, making it, for instance, if you make an appeal to an authority that people actively are hostile to or disregard or think as not only as not truthful, but like,
yes, I wasn't quoting the rabbis of the Talmud.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm quoting the people that presumably JF respects. So saying like, like I tell my fellow Jews, it's like, you're not arguing with me, you're arguing with Moses. So I'm saying like, to like JF, like, you're not arguing with me, you're arguing with Leibniz, you're arguing with Newton, you're arguing with Locke, you're arguing with Bacon. Saying the very people that laid the foundation for you to be able to do what you're doing, you're arguing with those people, not me. And that's where usually I found the best debate type thing. It's not, nothing personal. You're just wrong, and I'm just the one delivering you the evidence and the facts. And you're saying, don't argue with me. You just haven't done your own homework. Read Leibniz. If you haven't read Leibniz yet, I recommend you doing it, and you'll come back and thank me. Which is basically like, as a Jew, that's what I would do to you. Just saying like, you're just arguing with the Talmud. You just haven't educated yourself yet. Spend a few years, start studying Talmud. You'll have a different perspective. You'll come back and we'll have completely different style conversations. So, that's why I wanted to put this episode out there and saying this is from the best of the European Western sages, and saying, yes, you should believe in a soul. It is logical. There's nothing contradictory about it. And we could talk about the implications later, but, this stream was mainly, direct response. And I wanted to lay out as much evidence as I could in as short as possible, and like PowerPoint presentations. So even if people dislike me, they could just look at and say, and to some extent, like, you'd have to pay thousands of dollars for this. Like this, this is basically college level material of a bunch of different courses condensed into a few hours. And, this is a springboard for really years and years of research, because I've been researching this for years.
UC Duvis has free courses. They're here for the taking, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's saying the power of the internet, and it's saying, increase the IQ content of the conversations of the streams that we appear on, and saying it'll better everybody to increase the intellectual content of this. And when people so they're just talking out of their asses or don't know what they're saying, that they won't waste everyone's time, and they'll do more homework, and then we could further research. It's like I told JF, I disagree with him about evolution, but I encourage him in his research. I support scientific research. I support natural selection. I support him trying to come up with a theory. I support him writing a book. I just disagree with him about evolution. So do you want to go through these last two slides?
Oh yeah. I was just waiting for you to go back into that, unless you had any more thoughts on the stream, or were there any super chats? For instance, did Halsey send a super chat?
There were some super chats, and actually, like I'd mentioned the super chat. Someone had asked the Epicurean Trilemma in the super chat about that how could God be all powerful, all knowledgeable, and all good, but evil still happen? And I'd mentioned Leibniz, and I actually spent quite a bit of time reading Leibniz, and then I have a whole course. If I'm the screen share, I have this conference, Leibniz Theodicy, Reception and Relevance in Monacism, these conference, tens of hours on YouTube. I was watching this Yale course on Plato's theory of the soul, the science of consciousness conferences, top scientists from all over the world. That was like 4 hours of
Yeah, they have some pretty interesting stuff in those streams, in those long videos.
I got another one
from lectures. Like I watch a lot of anthropology lectures, and like meeting of like anthropological societies, like West Coast physical anthropologists was actually one that I went to in person. Like, have you ever been to any of these sort of academic conferences? They're actually pretty interesting because sometimes you get real life blood sport events, which is
University of Michigan. I've never traveled to one of them, but when they come to Michigan, I'll even occasionally go down. So I follow University of Michigan. It's only an hour away from me. So if there's something like that, I'll drive down to it. So I got two last slides. I'll do the quicker one first. Scientific ways of knowing. So this picture, I'm sure you're familiar with, the School of Athens. I'm sure you've seen this famous picture. I think I'm not sure in the Vatican or Rome, what building it's in. You got Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down, and then the other people. So scientific method: state the problem, gather information about the problem, form a hypothesis, perform an experiment to test the hypothesis, record and analyze your data, state a conclusion. Yes, the scientific method could be applied to spirituality. So do scientists just always use the scientific method? So they say no. The problem is that it's pretty clear that there is not a single method that scientists use. There's more to it. There's scientific ways of knowing. There's induction, inductive logic, proceeding from examples to general rules. Induction leads to empirical approaches of understanding. Then there's deduction, using rules to understand examples. Deduction leads to theoretical approaches to understanding. Some argue, what's a stronger proof, induction or deduction, which is arguable, but saying there's different schools within the scientific method. There's logic, premises to conclusion, inductive logic, examples. People could look this stuff up, or pause it on the slide because you just want to get through this. Have you took courses on the basics of logic? Are you there, Babs? I don't hear him, but saying if anyone studied logic, so here Plato pointing upwards, indicating that knowledge comes from pure thought, emphasizing theoretical models and deductive approach. Aristotle pointing down, indicating knowledge comes from the world, emphasizing empirical data and an inductive approach. Both of them are useful. Francis Bacon introduced inductive logic in its modern form. He wasn't actually a scientist, he was more a philosopher, a logician. So the success of science depends on keeping the eye steadily fixed on the facts of nature, and so receiving their images simply as they are. Scientific ways of knowing, induction approach is observing, deduction, the approach is modeling. Empirical approaches require that data is collected from the natural world. Consequently, scientists are very careful about observations, something that everyone will agree on, versus inference, interpretation, something based both on observation and an individual perspective, like spirituality. So we have evidence meter, from suggestive, presumptive, permissive to compelling. Different things have different abilities for their provability. Here's from Goethe. Of all discoveries and opinions, none may have exerted a greater effect on the human spirit than the doctrine of Copernicus. The world has scarcely become known as round and complete in itself when it was asked to waive the tremendous privilege of being the center of the universe. Never perhaps was a greater demand made on mankind, for by this admission so many things vanished in the midst of smoke. What became of our Eden, our world of innocence, piety, and poetry, the testimony of the senses, the conviction of the poetic, religious faith? No wonder his contemporaries did not wish to let all of this forgo, and offered every possible resistance to a doctrine which its converts authorized and demanded a freedom of view and the greatness of thought so far unknown, indeed not even dreamed of. And maybe if Babs is still there after, I'll discuss the rabbinic responses to some of this. Ptolemy used natural observation for the purpose of geocentrism. The Earth is at the center of the solar system, and the planets and the sun rotate around the Earth. Copernicus used natural observation to propose heliocentrism. What are the relevant observations that can use as evidence for geocentrics? They're heliocentric. The sun rises and sets every day. The moon goes fully illuminated to fully dark every 29 days. Sun, moon, and all planets move in a single plane in space called the ecliptic. The sun does not always cover the same stars in the sky. In fact, we can divide the sky into 12 more or less equal parts that lie along the ecliptic. These are the signs of the zodiac. It takes approximately 365 days to make it through all the signs of the zodiac. Some planets appear to have retrograde motion. That means they move generally forward, but occasionally move backwards west to east for short periods of time. This was an extremely complicated problem for the ancients to solve. And as Ptolemy had this epicycle system to try to explain this complicated motion that appeared in the sky where it looked like the planet was moving forward and then all of a sudden moves backwards a few days and moves forward again. And this will be solved by showing that it's in fact the sun that's at the center and the Earth is going around the sun, and the Earth being in the center led to these complicated epicycle of the Ptolemaic model, although the Ptolemaic model was relatively accurate in predicting results. So Copernicus is an optical illusion for planets that are further from the sun than we are. So, I mean, this is pretty complicated physics if anyone's familiar with this retrograde problem that Copernicus worked on. So you had two theories, Ptolemy and Copernicus. And, so good scientific theory, logically consistent, part of it don't contradict other parts, agrees with the data, suggests verifiable causes that explain and predict, advanced comparisons, simplicity, trade-off of generality and specificity, distinctions between non-fatal difficulties and fatal difficulties. So Occam's razor, William Occam, two or more models accurately explain the observation, no problem. Best model is the simplest one, fewest assumptions, modifications need to fit the observations. So what's more acceptable, Ptolemy or Copernicus? Galileo resolves the dispute using new technology, the telescope. The moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus. Ptolemaic system and Copernican system made different predictions about the shadows of Venus. So the new evidence of the telescope and the new moons of Venus, the shadows, according to the Ptolemaic model, did not match the reality, and the Copernican model did match the reality. So back to heliocentrism. So the list of the narrative. Aristotle proposes geocentrism. Ptolemy founds dative, retrograde model that doesn't fit with the theory. Ptolemy has two models, propose a new theory or modify the old theory to fit new data. That's what he did. Copernicus comes up with a new theory, heliocentrism, using exactly the same data as Ptolemy, using Occam's razor. Copernicus' model is superior. The idea is resisted because of social concerns, preconceived assumptions, and lack of understanding of physics. Yet the model is used because of its predictive power, but not adopted as reality. New technology allows Galileo to make observations, phases of Venus, moons of Jupiter, that are consistent with heliocentrism and not with Earth-centered universe. Hence, heliocentrism is adopted by scientists. So scientific law, generalization of observation data that describe patterns or relations, law change as new data become available, scientific hypothesis, a tentative explanation that accounts for a set of facts and can be tested by further investigation, scientific theory, systematic sets of concepts that provide explanations for observing patterns in nature, theories provide frameworks for relating data and guiding future research, theories change as new data becomes available. And we covered a lot of that information before. So last slide. Let me see, did Babs go away? You look telling me he's not here anymore. So last slide. So I mean, here we see, what is science? How did the Occam's razor and the scientific method come to use? That Ptolemy was a scientist. He used the best of his ability, came up with the model of the Earth in the center and these adaptations of the elliptics and different things to correspond with observation. And then Copernicus comes up with a different model of the Earth in the center, and that corresponds better with the data. And hence the scientific method, although it's possible that the Earth is at the center, it's much more easy and reasonable to accept the sun being at the center. And see that in terms like evolution or different things, what's real science, what's provable, what does the observation see, and using the scientific method, so to say, to postulate the origins of consciousness, the soul, God, the spirit world, life after death, and all these different things that we use the best of our knowledge to try to understand. So last one, epistemology, theory of knowledge. So this one's going to have Spinoza. You got two categories, rationalization and empiricism. Rationalization, rationalism, those who assert that by reason alone we can discover knowledge, like Plato. School emphasizes that our senses cannot give any certain knowledge. True knowledge is already within our minds in the form of innate ideas which we do not acquire but are born with. Plato and Descartes are examples of rationalism. Empiricism, those who assert that we obtain knowledge solely by our senses. Empiricism is usually developed in countries where the dominant interest has been practical and worldly. Modern empiricism grew out of the philosophical struggles of the 17th century England, when that country was rapidly developing commercially and industrially. Roger Bacon, John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume, famous empiricists. Plato, Aristotle. So we had, Socrates, the Apology, account of Socrates' speech in defense of himself as trio. The Credo, Plato's defense as being a loyal citizen of Athens. More Greek wisdom. The transition period. Maturity. The Meno, the Phaedo. The Meno takes up the teachability of virtue. The Phaedo, doctrines of ideas, immortality of the soul, are interwoven. The Demiurge is brought in the Phaedo. The Symposium, the theory of ideas applied in the realm of beautiful. The Republic, with the cave, the same dualism as in the Phaedo or the Demiurge. The Phaedrus in work on love. The Greeks, always back to Aristotle and Plato. The Parmenides, Socrates defending himself against a series of criticism of the theory of ideas by Zeno and the Eleatic skill. There's a lot of Greek wisdom out there. Timaeus, I wish I knew more about this, and time permitting, I will learn more about this. I've actually spent lots of time studying this, and I still know very little about it. But you know that almost everything that we're discussing now was discussed by the Greeks. So Plato's epistemology cannot be found systematically in any one work. You have to pull it out of multiple works. True knowledge is infallible and real. The theory of forms and ideas we discussed at the beginning. Knowledge is related to the good, but not the good itself. Knowledge is the eternal realm of the essence. There's a world of being, unchanging ideas. There's also a world of becoming, ever-changing. There's a third realm called space. Interpretation of the theory of ideas. Any attempt to reduce it to a principle interpreted as a whole is futile. The concept of an idea must not be interpreted as being a subjective concept in the mind. It has an objective reality. So Plato, we discussed at the beginning, that ideas are perfect in the spiritual realm and only representative of imperfect things in the material world, which Aristotle disagreed with. Ideas have threefold significance: ontological, in that they represent real being; theological, all ideas have ends and aims to their being; logical, the ideals enable us to bring order into the chaos of individual beings. The ideas exist in a sphere apart from our reality. So the Phaedo teaches that the soul existed before its union with the body in a transcendental realm. The process of knowledge consists essentially in recollection. God or the demiurge form things of this world according to the model of the forms. It has a Pythagorean influence. So the allegory of a cave, another nice picture of the cave allegory. Knowledge advances from stages. From sense perception, it proceeds to pure thought. Mathematics, from pure thought, it proceeds to an idea, mathematical knowledge to a dialectic science, and from the ideal realm to beyond, from ideas to the good. The allegory shows the ascent of the mind from the lower sections to the higher as epistemological progress. Prisoners represent the majority of humankind. We live in a world of shadows. The view of the world is distorted by the shadows. We cling to the distorted views. The cave also represents the importance of proper education. A nice diagram. To Descartes. Cartesian doubt. Considered to be the founder of modern philosophy, first philosopher to allow the new physics and astronomy to affect his philosophical system. During the 30 Years' War, he had a dream in which he said the spirit of truth opened him to the treasures of all science. He recorded the incidents in the Discourse of Method. He also has a book on meditations. Preaches the duty of doubt. He wanted to go beyond the senses to the beginning of knowledge. In the second Meditations, uses wax as an example of our senses deceive us. By concentrating only on what he knew for certain, he began what we know as Cartesian doubt. The method of Cartesian doubt begins by doubting everything that he could manage to doubt. First begins doubting sense experience. One thing I cannot doubt is my own experience. While I wanted to think everything false, it must necessarily be that I, who thought was something, in remarking this, I think, therefore I am, was so certain that almost extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of upsetting it. I judged that I could receive it without scruple as the first principle of philosophy that I sought. You're saying, can you doubt that you exist? Having set a secure foundation, he set to work to rebuild the edifice of knowledge. I am a thing that thinks. My existence is different from the physical world, that the soul is wholly distinct from the body. What was the cognito so evident? Why is the thinking so evident? Because it's clear and distinct, thus all things that we conceive clearly and distinctly are true. He deals with knowledge of our bodies, and he uses the example of wax. Proving the existence of an external world can be done only by proving the existence of God. His proof of God's existence is similar to Anselm's ontological argument. Everything is a cause. We have an idea of God. Nothing less than God is adequate to cause our idea of God. Besides the ideas of self and God, there was another set of ideas which were seen to be innate without any reference to the external world, the truth of mathematics. All their knowledge comes to us from the outside world. So empirical emphasis. Descartes realized that one could proceed by deduction only a short distance from the apex of a pyramid. A deduction from intuitively self-evident principles is of limited usefulness in science. It would yield only the most general of laws. He also posited the belief that one cannot determine from a mere conclusion of general laws the cause of physical processes. For one to be able to deduce a statement about a particular effort, it would be necessary to include among the premises information about the circumstances under which the events occur. An important tool for observation and pure experimentation is to provide knowledge of the conditions under which events of a given type takes place. Primary qualities, secondary qualities. In his doubting process, he had to prove what is clear and distinct about a physical object. He would use a lump of wax as an example. We understand the real nature of the wax through intuition. Such intuition is to be distinguished from the sequences of appearances. He would distinguish between those primary qualities which all bodies must possess and secondary qualities which exist only in the perceptual experience of the subject. He believed that God created a universe of infinite extension, thus no vacuum in motion, and science thus reduced to measurements in mathematics. All changes must come through motion. Motion could neither increase nor decrease, but only transferred from one body to another. The universe continued to run as a machine, and each body persists in a state of motion in a straight line, the geometric simplest form in which God set it going, unless acted on by an external force. So general scientific laws. From his understanding of extension, he would develop several important physical principles. He seemed to believe that because the concept of extension and motion are in clear and distinct, certain generalizations about these concepts must be considered as a priori truths. One generalization is that all motion is caused by impact or pressure, due to his belief that no vacuum can exist, thus every entity must be touched by another entity. However, he denied the possibility of action at a distance in effort to defend a thoroughgoing mechanistic view of causation. Such a view would be revolutionary in his day. This belief would be a denial of magnetism and gravity. Another generalization is derived from the idea of extension, is that all motion is a cyclical rearrangement of bodies. If one body changes its location, a simultaneous displacement of other bodies is necessary to prevent a vacuum. Descartes wrote that God is the ultimate cause of motion. A perfect being would create a universe at all at once, and this perfect being would keep motion going, otherwise the universe would run down. John Mach. Essay concerning human understanding. He attempts to show how various concepts and ideas come from and are built up from different kinds of experience. Denial of innate ideas. There are no principles or ideas that we have any reason to believe we have prior to or independent from our senses. So the white paper, the tabula rasa, lack belief that our minds are like a white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. Two sources of knowledge: perception and reflection. Simple ideas. Simple ideas are the most basic of our knowledge. Simple ideas are presented to us in sensation and reflection. So the mind experiences simple ideas. It has the power to store up, to repeat, and to combine them. Primary and secondary qualities. A primary quality is those items in our experiences which must belong to the objects that we are. Secondary qualities are nothing in the objects themselves, but powers to produce various sensations in us by primary qualities, such as color. Kinds of knowledge discussed in the fourth book of the essays. How reliable can knowledge of sensation and reflection be? Our knowledge is the result of the examination of ideas. It's see if they agree or disagree in some respect. Four kinds. First kind is achieved by the inspection of two or more ideas to see if they are identical or different. Second kind is the discovery that two or more ideas are related together in some manner. Third kind is about ideas, which deals with the coexistence of two or more ideas belonging together. Fourth kind is knowledge, is the discovery of whether or not any of our ideas are experiences of something that exists outside of our minds, if they are some real existence. External reality. In order to keep his theory of knowledge from ending to calling knowledge one's person's experience based at one's observations, he attempted to show that even with our limited knowledge gained from experience, we have some basis for claiming that we know something about what goes on outside our minds. The mind is incapable of inventing simple ideas, that thus they must be the result of something outside of our minds. His view on prospects and limitations of science are found in his essay. He had a view accepting primitive concepts of atoms. Thus, in order to be able to predict mechanical behavior, one would need to know the configurations and motion of atoms, know the ways in which the motion of atoms produce ideas of primary and secondary qualities in the observer. If the two conditions were met, then one would know a priori that certain properties would be identified with entities. However, we are ignorant of the configurations, motions of atoms, as ignorant is contingent. Know the ways in which the motion of atoms produced ideas of primary and secondary qualities in the observer, but we still could not reach a necessary knowledge of phenomena since we were ignorant of the ways in which atoms manifest certain powers. The atomic constituents of a body possess the power through motion to produce in us ideas of secondary qualities such as colors and sounds. Also, the atoms of a particular body have the power affect the atoms of other bodies so as to alter the ways in which these bodies affect our senses. Only by divine revelation could we know the ways in which atomic motions produce effects in us. He also held that his unbridgeable epistemological gap separates the real world of atoms and the realm of ideas that constitute our experience. He recommended a methodological of correlation and exclusion for scientific investigation based on compilation of extensive natural histories. This understanding involved a shift in focus from real essence, atomic configuration of bodies, to nominal essence, the observed properties and relations of bodies. He insisted that the most that can be achieved in science is a collection of generalizations about the associations, successions of phenomena. He somewhat degenerated natural science that trained scientists may have judgment and opinion, not knowledge and certainty. He did not believe that there exist necessary connections in nature, even though the connections are opaque to human understandings. The use of the term idea was between gaps. Ideas are effects of operations in the real world of atoms. Thus, red is produced by the processes external to the subject. He was confident that the motions of the atomic constituents of matter that give rise to our ideas of colors and taste, even though we cannot learn just how this takes place. Then we got David Hume, carried British empiricism to a skeptical blind alley by contending that belief is the identity of the self or objects in the external world was simply the result of a habit. Identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together, but is merely a quality which we attribute to them because of the union of the ideas in the imagination. In an inquiry concerning human understanding, he divided the perception of the mind into two classes: thought or ideas, the least forceful and lively. They are reflections of impressions resulting from direct experience, what we see, hear, feel. The creative power of the mind amount to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by our senses and experiences. In the synthesis of Immanuel Kant, he initiated a Copernican revolution in philosophy, reaction to radical empiricism of David Hume, freed theology from corrosion of classical empiricism while maintaining a rationality of religious belief. Kant responded that Hume and the empiricist had a passive and dualistic view of cognition, which conceived of the mind as simply a receptor of particular sense impressions. Kant emphasized that the mind is active instead of beginning with the object as something already given to, which the mind must conform, reverses the order and conceives of the object as in some respect constituted by the a priori contribution of the knower. The mind imposes upon the material of experience in its own forms, and cognition determined by the very structure of human understanding. The raw materials of experience is thus modeled and shaped along certain definite lines according to the cognitive forms of the mind itself. These forms of the mind are the way we put things together. All experience pre-propose thus a priori categories which are not themselves observable. The cognitive forms of experiences determine the possibilities of objects of knowledge. The categories of experience determine our knowledge of phenomenon. If the word objects were taken to refer to things in themselves, things apart from any relation to a knowing subject, then we could not say they are known by the human mind. We cannot thus know noumena, things in themselves, supersensible objects, for we lack the necessary cognitive organ. He looks at the nature of judgment in four ways: analytical judgment, rational and deductive, in which the predicate is contained within the subject and may be known by analysis of it. Baldwin have no hair. Synthetical judgment, empirical, inductive, one in which the predicate is not contained in the subject. The rose is red. A priori judgment, rational, one in which asserts a universal necessary connection, like 2 + 2 = 4, always and must be a judgment before the fact. And post prior judgment, empirical, one which does not assert a universal necessary connection, and judgment after the fact, like the rose is red. For Kant, the major question is whether there is a synthetic a priori judgment, those judgments in which predicates are not contained within the subject but are still universal and necessary. He concluded they were. Math as an example. Kant gives two sources of knowledge: sensibility, the use of senses; understanding, the rational processes of the mind. Okay, still got 11 people here. The link in the chat if anyone wants to come on. That's the end of my presentations. There's still a lot more to talk about, and just wanted to get some of that information out there on my page. Hopefully tomorrow I'm going to add a table of contents to people so they could look through and see what is science, what is thought, what's more provable. So we're thinking like Cofnas, KMAC. You're saying those are soft sciences relatively. So we could think and talk about it, but it's almost political in nature. They're not, the same sort of science as physics and Newton. So I'm done with my presentation. I just put the link in the chat. I'll put it there again in case someone wants to come on. I'm pretty beat. It's 1:30 here. Fireworks are done. I'll have to read through this chat tomorrow. I saw almost none of the chat. I'll see how long Babs, if he said anything, I didn't have my earphone in. I couldn't even tell he had joined. Let's see. So I guess hope people enjoy this, and maybe people enjoy more talking to each other. Tell me here, I got Content Watcher, Duvid's roommate, James, John Harris, Metasophies Lux, Tom Anderson, and a few more people watching that aren't here. The link's in the chat. Anyone's got a question to ask, otherwise I'm going to sign off. Enjoy doing this. Hope this increases the intellectual content of our future streams. And hopefully people that saw me on JF, will come to my channel and research this and provide better answers to the questions they were asking. And if I speak to JF this coming week, that I'll have proper preparations. So, the last time we argued evolution, and I took the negative on evolution, and maybe next time we'll argue the soul, and I'll take the affirmative or the spiritual realm, or trying to apply the scientific method to spiritual phenomenon.
Yo, David.
My roommate.
Yo, David.
Yep.
What do you think about Nathan Cofnas?
I read his paper. I mean, it was pretty good, pretty interesting. I'm a soul person, so I agree. I mentioned that earlier. I agreed with KMAC from this greater perspective. I think there's a greater force that binds the Jewish people, and that if you look at it from a personal level, from Mark Zuckerberg with his Chinese wife, to Sergey Brin and the creators of Google, to ultra orthodox Hasidic rabbis, me, you, Babs, we're pretty incoherent. But from a greater perspective, there definitely is some sort of group strategy. And to me, KMAC made sense, although I don't apply it to genetics or evolution. I apply it to the soul, or to biblical prophecies, the wisdom of the sages. So Cofnas, in that sense, I'm probably more on the side of KMAC than Cofnas from that perspective. I do think there is some sort of group pressure that binds us Jews together in the spiritual realm.
All right.
And so, in that, I think Cofnas, he's smart. He added some things. I learned from him. I read his papers and his reply, and it got kind of boring, tedious. It was just basically tit for tat. And it was kind of small, arguments of trying to put a flaw in it. And I had to more agree with KMAC not because of KMAC himself or his arguments, but I do think there's something. I'm not sure if you're a complete atheist, or you do think there is some greater power binding the Jewish people, holding us together.
I'd say I fall in line with Spinoza's conception of God.
But I'm saying there is some, when you think not that there's a council meeting of the, saying there doesn't have to be the elders of Zion. There doesn't have to be some world Zionist organization. There's some spiritual guiding power that binds the Jewish people without there being a conspiracy. And in that sense, Cofnas is, what's the argument? No, we're just random, haphazardly, Jews are smart. And, there is no order to the Jewish people. The Jews are basically part of everything, contradicting each other, fighting each other with no, and you can't really make.
I don't think that was what he was saying, but I was wondering, when you brought up Zuckerberg's Asian wife, are there any Asian Hasids? Have you ever met one? An Asian Hasid convert?
Yeah, I remember in Jerusalem. I remember this Asian guy who had long payas. I've seen a few modern Orthodox, but I remember very clearly an Asian guy. There's an African American convert in the neighborhood near me who married a woman convert. So not super common, but yeah, I've seen it a few times. And obviously you have the Chinese, or a few people, Jews that were supposedly always Jews from China that returned to Israel and took up Israeli citizenship. When you see it, I'm saying KMAC in that sense has the easier, better side of the argument. If he's saying no, there's some group pressure that binds all Jews together, versus Cofnas is saying no, it's just basically haphazard. There's Jews, there's a group of Jews, but there's nothing really binding us together, and we fight each other, and there really is no group, and we're all moving in different directions without a logical pattern. And in that sense, Like I'm going to have to agree with KMAC over Cofnas.
I think what he was essentially saying was there are enough outliers and there's enough evidence that would go against the evolutionary strategy and pointing out some of the way KMAC dealt with facts or didn't deal with them. And that was essentially what he was saying. Like, this isn't
well, he might have hit a few. I'm not saying I'm not.
He
I mean, he definitely found a few holes in his.
I don't think all the ideas of
culture. I meant the thesis. I mean, minus the evolutionary explanation for the thesis, and certainly, Cofnas pointed some holes in his research or possible contradictions, but generally, I think KMAC's thesis still stands. Cofnas wasn't able to dispute the thesis that there's a group evolutionary strategy of the Jewish people, and that includes things like multiculturalism and pushing for immigration. That generally, that even though you have outliers from the Jewish community, that's in the best interest of the larger Jewish community, and that the Jewish community as a whole generally were pushed for these issues. And that's how you could keep together. Like, you want to keep Sergey Brin and Mark Zuckerberg in the fold, right? Like, you're not willing to just give up Mark Zuckerberg, like, oh, he's not a Jew.
How do we get Cofnas on a stream with you? Tom Anderson's wondering. I think that's a great idea.
I have no idea. I'm saying, like, Luke Ford, I guess, he shared and reached out to him. And in fact, Luke Ford is the only stream I ever saw Cofnas on. I searched him a few times. I never saw him anywhere besides that 1 or 2 times he showed up on Luke Ford.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's like an expert on Judaism. I'm saying he's like an expert scholar on like the philosophy of science or something like that, or biology. He's not like a big scholar about Judaism.
Yeah. Well,
and so, like, I don't know if it'd be room for a debate.
I don't think. I think KMAC's whole theory has very little to do with religion when it comes down to it. I mean, there's like the Talmudic element to the culture.
Well, I was going to say, I reject evolution completely as the reason. So I just ignored it. When I went through KMAC, I just ignored like the evolutionary explanations, but I appreciate his research and scholarship and his history of the Jewish people and these greater forces argument. But when you just, every time that KMAC said evolution and genes, I my mind like blanked that out and I said God, Hashem. If that makes sense. Like, just every time KMAC said evolution and genes, I just said, like, you mean Hashem, right?
What?
Saying that God, Hashem, like the Hashem, the God of the Jews, that every time KMAC says is the reason for his explanation of genetics and evolution, I just said, well, you're right about what you're saying. You're wrong that the cause is evolution and genes. The cause is Hashem. The cause is the biblical prophecies.
Well, okay, so on that, if that's your idea, then why, if Hashem, so then Hashem is causing the very things that people accuse us of and eventually leads to our expulsion or mass execution in like well over 100 countries? That seems crazy. Why?
Well, that's what the Bible says.
Why is Hashem pushing us towards our own demise?
Well, he's not. I'm saying he's pushing towards the Jewish people are the method that Hashem uses to push progress forward and to reach this universal brotherhood of man and messianic order. And it's kind of like, like redeem the world or die trying, so to say. And Jews, whether we like it or not, from whether we're religious or not, are part of this dispensation eschatological push to drive progress forward. So if we're successful, we're rewarded. If we're not successful, we're the bulk of the punishment. And saying whether Jews realize it or not, just when you attach yourself to the name Jew, you're being attached to these biblical prophecies.
Yeah, well,
and so the expulsions and the persecutions make sense because the Bible says that's going to happen to us. There's nothing that's happened to the Jewish people throughout history that wasn't prophesied and predicted by the prophets. And it's almost, befitting that when these, God forbid, bad things happen, and you say, well, of course, haven't you read the Bible?
Yes.
So
Right.
if you're a Jew trying to run away from the Bible,
right, but
the Bible's going to.
okay, but your theological, like,
you want to hold on to the Jewish name but reject the Bible, but
no,
the Bible always catches up to you.
Well, I want to know that, like, so basically you're saying that the God-given fate of the Jews is to just relive that the same kind of traumatic event over and over and over and over until the Messiah comes. That's the fate.
Yeah, but there's the positive side also. The positive side of Jewish power, Jewish wealth, Jewish excellence. So there's the up and down side of it. But yeah, I'm saying like we have a big weight on our shoulders, like the management class. If things go good, we're going to get huge bonuses. And if they don't go good, God forbid, the peasants are going to revolt and kill us.
What? Say that one more time, please.
If things go good, we're going to get huge bonuses. And if they don't go good, God forbid, the peasants are going to revolt and kill us.
I mean,
and that's what it means to be a Jew. When you look in the mirror and see a Jew, you should be like, David, I agree with you. That's essence. You're right. That's the definition of a Jew.
Yeah, I guess I just know too many Jews who would disagree with you to say that that's the essence. I mean, it depends. I guess you're a Jew who believes fully, in prophecy, but most Jews don't.
Yeah, most Jews the point is the prophecy holds true whether you believe it or not. It doesn't matter whether Mark Zuckerberg believes it or not, because you could see it being fulfilled through him, whether he believes it or not. Just so
like was part of the prophecy that we unravel the fabric of Western society. Our most powerful people, is that part of the prophecy? Because that's happening. Mark Zuckerberg is completely.
Yeah, because that's the universal brotherhood of man. That Mark Zuckerberg would marry a Chinese woman. Mark Zuckerberg would bring billions and billions of people from all over the world, and now they're on Facebook, and 500 million Chinese and Indian, Philippine, all these people, they're on Facebook.
Right.
Or even Google, like YouTube, Google, by Jude, like Sergey Brin or whatever, the creators of Google. They probably reject the prophecy in the Bible, but at the same time, you could be like, well, clearly the Bible is being fulfilled through them.
I'm not studied enough on Torah to know, but is there anything that says that, like, with this kind of great power will come great destruction, like at the hands of those powerful Jews? Is there anything that would indicate that is woven into?
It's in the second paragraph of the Shema. When you say Shema Yisrael, and you have the first paragraph, V'ahavta Hashem, okay, you should love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And you're saying, teach it to your kids, and when you lie down, and when you get up, and put it on your arm and the doorpost. And the second paragraph talks about if you fulfill the commandments, then all these good things are going to happen to you. You're going to have bounty, and it talks mostly through farming analogies. But if we fulfill the commandments, we're going to have all these good things happen to us. And if we don't fulfill the commandments, it's going to be destruction. So if you're a religious Jew and say the Shema twice a day, it's in that prayer. If you have a mezuzah or tefillin, if you open up your mezuzah,
right,
and you pull out the verse that's in your mezuzah, that second paragraph of your mezuzah talks about if you fulfill the commandments, you're going to get all this beautiful reward, and if you don't fulfill the commandments, there's going to be destruction.
Right. But you're talking about, okay, because I see some big contradictions in what you're saying. So you're talking.
Do you have a mezuzah?
My parents do.
So relatively, every time you enter your house, that's what it says inside that thing.
Right, but it doesn't. So the people who bring about the universal brotherhood of man, as you say, that is part of the prophecy. Is there anything in the prophecy that says that the bringing about of the universal brotherhood of man will also lead to the steamrolling of all culture and like social unraveling on like an unprecedented scale and with an unprecedented speed?
Yeah, probably there is. I mean, you have to look through the prophecies of
where
in Ezekiel. I mean, this was like my science stream on science and proof of the soul, not like you want to go through like a study of Isaiah and Ezekiel. But yeah, there's a lot of prophecies that, if you follow the commandments, these things will happen. If you don't, and saying that people are selfish. I'm saying, yeah, that in essence, this pressure on people of globalization and multiculturalism is good. It's a force of God, and people are against it. Like, no, I don't want to change. I'm scared of these people. And it's saying, really, they're scared of God. They have to surrender and have faith in God. And and the Jews are really, in that sense, they're a force for good, but it has to be done in the right way. You're saying we're usurious and doing it just for our own advantage, and we don't obey God, and we're not appreciative to God and our status in this. It could be destructive. But I'm saying that's why I say multiculturalism, universal brotherhood of man, is going to be good for people. People are just aren't ready for it.
Hey, Guvit. I've heard conflicting things about. Tom Anderson says, does Goyim actually mean cattle? Or does Goyim means cattle, doesn't it? I've heard
it means nations. Goyim means nation, and Goyim plural means nations.
Okay, so what's up with everybody thinking it means cattle?
No idea. I mean, the cattle's a different word.
I remember reading that on Stormfront when I was like 13 years old. I started reading Stormfront around the time of my bar mitzvah. I think, I was rebellious or whatever. And I remember reading that, and it didn't really correlate with what I had been being taught.
But I'm saying the point, like, people want to up their intellectual contact and know the truth. And saying, yeah, just admit it, you're scared. So people are like, I'm scared about multiculturalism. I'm scared about all these different type people that I don't know about. And just saying, like, but don't be scared because God's going to protect you. And saying, don't blame the Jews for playing our part in the unfolding of history. And you're saying, as a Jew, you shouldn't be scared, but you should recognize that there's we're at like the high stakes table, so to say. Like, you're born a Jew. When you call yourself a Jew, you're intrinsically at the high stakes table.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know where I stand on the PQ, the prophecy question. It's something I guess I would. My faith.
Are you cooking or something? You're getting a lot of random noise in the background.
Yeah, I'm eating something right now. I'm eating some vegetables.
Are you there, Babs, too?
Babs is here. Babs, where do you stand on the PQ, the prophecy question?
I don't know.
Babs is muted. Can you unmute Babs, David?
I don't know.
You don't know where
he's mumbling. He's mumbling, not muted. I've been streaming for like 7 hours. I streamed with Claire for like 2 hours, talking to that guy Jay in London, and then I had my like 2-hour earlier stream, the Ask the Rabbi, Jewish History and the Laws of Lashon Hara, hate speech, and we're going like 2.5 hours on science and the proof of the soul with these presentations. You two want to talk to each other a few minutes? I'll leave the stream going, and I could like get a drink or like. Or should I close it up? There's 15 people watching, but I'm not sure if you and Babs want to talk for a few minutes.
We'll say what up to Babs. I gotta go to bed soon.
Or should I close it up?
Your call, Bab.
I don't hear him. Whatever reason, he's not. If he's not, I can't hear him. Okay, yeah, well, nice talking. To be continued. Like, I said, I wanted to have this intellectual content on my channel. It's nice to keep on talking about these issues, and maybe like what we're talking now is better for more like a Jew stream or topic, because I like to have, I'm trying to stream on topics so that this content is good for months or something that people
could you do a Spinoza stream sometime?
The what?
A Spinoza stream.
I'm not an expert in Spinoza. I'd have to do some research on that. I'm saying, like, if you know Spinoza, do your own stream. I don't
have any subscribers. I can't stream.
I mean, do you have a presentation? I mean, we could do a stream together. I mean, I don't have such a huge base. I seem to have some base. I'm getting like 10 to 20 viewers, and I got almost 300 subscribers now. So if you actually did some research and had a presentation, like I like Spinoza, it's interesting to me. But
like, I could always stand to learn more. Let's give ourselves a due date and a book list to do a Spinoza stream in like a month.
But time is limited, so I don't know if I have time. I have like hundreds of books that I haven't read. I have, I just
put it on the back burner
then. But I'm saying if you did the research, I would stream with you or invite you to my channel to present it. Although, like, I don't know if you're telling me like to do a book report on Spinoza. I don't know how much time I have.
We could both do one together. It'll be.
I know quite a bit about Spinoza, like his history as a Jew. I was in Amsterdam. Like the writ of his expulsion is in the museum there. It's actually like nice and colored, and like God forbid, it's like cursed when he rides up, cursed when he come in, cursed when he goes. Have you read like his expulsion, his excommunication paper? It's like very poetic. He was like cursed when he rises, cursed when he sleeps, cursed when he comes in, cursed be when he goes, and it goes on for like 20 of those, like cursed when he this, cursed when he that, and it was written like a poem. It's kind of crazy, and I know a little bit about his philosophy. I've never actually opened up. I don't own any of Spinoza's books. I've never read any of Spinoza, although I know his basic, from the history of science, history of philosophy. I know his basic ideas, and I know where he fits into larger Jewish history. So if you did research and you wanted to present something, I know the generic frame that he fits into, but like I don't think I have the time. To me, like Leibniz is more interesting than Spinoza. Like, I mean, Spinoza is a Jew, but right now, to me, Leibniz and the development of calculus and science, I'm spending more time with that than Spinoza, and just not enough time for everything. Well, it's interesting enough. If you did the research, like I would definitely stream with you.
Do you like Hume?
Hume?
Yeah.
Yeah, Hume was part of empiricism. He was in my presentations today.
He was like the most radical empiricist. I missed your part on Hume.
Yeah, so Spinoza held that everything is one. There's no division between mind and spirit, as opposed to Descartes and Leibniz. Leibniz is possibly in the his monadism is slightly based. I mean, Leibniz had writes about Spinoza in response to Spinoza, and Descartes also responds to Spinoza disagreeing about him, because Descartes is a dualist.
Yes.
I think that's why I started with the Greeks, to show like really the Greeks had all these arguments before, and there's so they're flushing out and rehashing and expanding on arguments that Plato and Aristotle had already been through.
Do you think there can be a place for a monistic interpretation of prophecy?
Yeah, and essentially, I think the Torah Kabbalah is more monistic.
Kabbalah is more like this Neoplatonist theory of emanation thing, but there's still like a.
I'm saying it's monistic and dualistic at the same time. There's a spiritual realm and a physical realm. Both of them are completely controlled and created by Hashem, although they operate in.
Right, but there is like
they're interplayed. You're saying that the spiritual realm is manifested and permeates the material realm, but the material realm could operate according to mechanistic features, and so it's kind of like a combination. I mean, it's kind of like the Trinity paradox or something like that.
Well,
we're dualist and monist at the same time.
Right, but there's like still an idea of a demiurge and a godhead in Kabbalah, which is like a very dualistic kind of notion, in its essence.
Yeah, here James said, Duvid makes the average Jew look as dumb as us mere goyim.
Yeah, I gotta hand it to you. You've gathered a lot of knowledge in your day. It's admirable.
I'm putting this out there because, really, no one likes me. I'll never have a platform to say that if it wasn't for YouTube, but 20 years of research, 5 years in yeshiva and rabbinic study, five years in university.
Were your ideas well liked in yeshiva? I mean, how'd you do? Were you well liked by your professors and stuff, or were you
I'm pretty good studious student. I didn't have my own ideas back then, really. I was a good student, but I'm saying when I was in yeshiva and university, I didn't really have my own ideas. I was just, tried to be a good student and ask intelligent questions. So now after 20 years, and really like I'm exhausting my content. So I'm trying to put out content that doesn't really exist. And so I felt kind of good about that. Like, in saying like, all I do is study this stuff and I keep on looking for answers to my questions. And I'm really realizing that there's not really any more, there's not much information for me to go to on the web for answers to these questions. So now I'm putting out like 20 years of my research. And even the stream I just did today, like I compounded it from, different university courses and PowerPoints and put it into one presentation. But if I'd been able to find something like my stream tonight, I probably wouldn't have done it. I would have just been like, look, someone else already did it. So I felt pretty good at that. Like, I'm not sure I have any like unique ideas. More, it's still like a book report or an amalgamation of a lot of different data that hasn't been amalgamated. So I'm not actually sure whether I have any unique ideas yet.
When would you say your intellectual becoming was, and you started developing the doctrine of esoteric Judaism as opposed to just
I think it was like, Luke Ford and, putting him on the show in the alt-right and looking at these shows and like, could it be that I really know more about this than these other people? Like, I mean, I kind of understood like, okay, like I'm only a half Jew and I'm somewhat largely self-taught or unconventional. So no proper Jewish audience is ever going to put me at the pulpit. No Jewish audience is ever going to take me seriously. And but I'm watching the data that's publicly
Why
out
would
there.
no Jewish audience take you seriously? Because you're a half blood.
Yeah, I'm a half blood and I'm unconventional and I wasn't taught in conventional ways. So it just it's not the model. I didn't go through the model in the way that the people they put on the pulpits. Saying no synagogue is ever going to ask me to give the sermon. No yeshiva is going to ever ask me to come speak to their students.
You were a good yeshiva student, you said, right?
Yeah, I was a very serious student, good student. Saying I think I was pretty. I mean, not in the same. People may or may not have liked me, but I'm saying like everybody thought I was serious and studious and worked hard in university also.
Why didn't they like you?
Well, I'm pretty eccentric.
Are you even eccentric in the Hasidic community?
Yeah, I think I'm eccentric, anywhere I go, because like in the Hasidic community, like people conform to a certain amount of standards, and like I'm kind of a nonconformist. So even in the Hasidic world, like Hasidim are very eccentric relative to the secular world, but internally among Hasidim, they're pretty conformist. And so, I'm always a nonconformist. I always have these oddities, and it's like you can't be a Hare Krishna and a Chusaduv. That's impossible.
I see. Yeah, I forgot about the Hare Krishna.
It was something like that. I always had like, I mean, I wasn't doing the Hare Krishna thing when I was in yeshiva in Jerusalem, but I always had these oddities and eccentricities that were contradictory to the model student. Like I always had bad optics, so to say. There's to say like, this guy has bad optics. No synagogue.
How much of a source of inner turmoil and conflict has it been that you've like developed knowingly this eccentric kind of countercultural
well, I did for the stream.
It's kind of countercultural ethos, but
really I did
you're
this
also I
research.
see the source of conflict, like you say that with a certain amount of pride, but then I also hear like a certain amount of pain when you speak about your ideas not being received and not being able to get up on a pulpit and give a sermon at a real synagogue or speak at a yeshiva.
Yeah, I accept my lot, but yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of pain to it that, like, yeah, I mean, to be rejected from my own community is pretty painful. Like, to be an old bachelor, to not really be popular, it's painful. But there's a certain pride to it too that I stuck to my my outlook, to my morals. I never caved to the greater pressures, and so now I have random people on the web who probably like me, like I wanted information and I was searching for what was out there, and I came across YouTube pages, like JF and Luke Ford and a lot of intellectual things that I like to research this stuff. And so probably people here too, they want answers to questions that the answers don't seem readily available, and just like esoteric Judaism. Who the hell is this guy? I don't know, but he's talking about the things that I'm interested in.
How much of your pull and drive, your pull towards the alt-right, do you think was governed by the same like thing that pushes you in such countercultural directions, and is like kind of like part of like you have a bit, I can say from interacting with you and watching you interact with others, you have this kind of like soft antagonism going throughout, which I think is hilarious and really interesting. But I'm wondering how much of your like pull towards the alt-right was like, oh my God, like, okay, this will really freak them the fuck out if I start, like, not only am I Hare Krishna, but I'm like talking to Richard Spencer.
I think I'm just trying to do my own thing, like relatively. I'm not trying to like freak people out. Like I really want answers to these questions. I really want to continue my research, and I want to share these ideas. So like, yeah, I'm a big social critic. You're like Prabhupada of the Hare Krishna movement. There's a huge social critic.
How do you think
or like Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Jews, they're really huge social critics. They look at larger society, and like larger society is just completely messed up. You know,
it's kind of like the alt-right, which is
what's wrong with people. So like in that essence, like, yeah, like the alternative right is like, yeah, like what's wrong with people? Like I've been looking for, decades, and like I just really can't figure out like what's wrong with people. And so here's an alternative movement. And so in that extent, but like the Hasidim or something that comes to a conformatism, like Duvid, I'm not going to conform. Like I've never conformed my whole life. I'm not going to conform now. And like I didn't conform for any of these other movements. I'm not going to conform for the alt-right, but it's still an alternative movement. So as an alternative countercultural movement, there's room for someone like Duvid in it.
I think so. Duvid,
like my values are, like right. I mean, even though I'm not political and I have a lot of leftist leanings, personally, I'm a pretty like moral conservative person. I always consider, fiscally conservative. Like I was, more, morally opposed to degeneracy type things. So like alternative right to me, like, yeah, that's me. I'm alternative right. Though obviously they're word and definition games, and that's where Pilpul, like, I'm a Pilpul master. That's what I do. But eventually, like when they try to conform or converge, like certainly what they conform or converge to will not include me. It'll be like Groucho Marxism. Like I don't want to be a club of any place that would have me as a member. So like whatever they converge to, there's no way I'm going to be part of that.
Hey, Duvid, but like, okay, so what do you think your fellow congregants at your shul would say if they happen to like find your JF appearance? How would that go over?
I don't know, like the frame of it, like they say like JF, like that guy like interviewed David Duke later that night. Like, he's got all these, crazy people on his page. Or, would it be like, like evolution, like I hate evolution. Great job, David. That was one of the great, better evolution debates and I've seen in a long time. Like I never really liked you. You were always kind of weird, but like, wow, that was pretty cool. You were up there and you were fighting against evolution. Good job. I don't know. Like no one said that. Yeah, I see like a lot of people. Someone put in the super chat on JF. He's like, this is the first time on your show I agreed with the Jew. And so I could see a lot of people like, yeah, they're like, I never liked you, dude. You're always too weird. I never really even desired to speak with you, but like, good job. I hate evolution. Good job. Although there might be other people like, oh, you were ridiculous. Like, what the hell? Like, this is the most ridiculous thing ever. You're arguing with a bunch of crazy people about evolution. However crazy I thought you were, you're that much worse now.
Which answer would you prefer? Ultimately, because like the contrarian Duvid obviously wants that answer because it's something you seem to seek out. But then there's the other part of Duvid that wants the validation. It's an interesting dichotomy, and it's something that I probably struggle with in my personal life a bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, because I studied so much this esotericism for so long, like I basically trained myself to be equal to praise and insult. So like, yes, I would like to find a wife to settle down with and have children, and I'm so eccentric that like, maybe someone will come to these videos and really come to an understanding of me.
Claire Kaw, man.
And be like,
you want to really be eccentric in your community, shack up with Claire.
Yeah, man, but I'm saying we're not a fit. I'm saying I talk with her, I stream with her a few times, but someone who's my actual match, and just someone to actually understand, like, most of the people I go to shul with, they're like, I had no idea you knew all this stuff. I knew you were weird, but like I didn't know you were smart. Or I didn't know like you had read all these books or thought about all these things. It's like presumably most people that's what they would just think. Like, yeah, I mean, who's this weird guy? I didn't even know he was smart. I thought he was retarded.
do you have people in your community you are close with?
Yeah, here and there, but I'm saying your average person that I haven't spoke to, they probably think I'm retarded.
Why would they just think you're retarded off the bat without speaking to you?
Because I'm like autistic, you see like autistic, and they, like I'm an autistic savant or something like that. So they just know I'm autistic. That's like retarded. They don't know I'm a savant.
What? Right, but how would they know that without speaking to you?
They wouldn't.
Is that just your rep? Is that just your rep? Like, David has autism? Is that the? I don't think you're autistic. I think you have some like tendencies, but I think everyone here probably has similar.
Yeah, I'm saying there's like autistic, and there's like
you were able to go out and like rage in the party scene and like do coke and promote concerts and stuff. Like, you can't be that autistic. Like, you were obviously out partying with people and having friends.
I had money. Like I had protection and friends because I had money. So I mean, like, no, I mean, if I was just eccentric and weird, it's only because I was able to play the system and had money to, to work it out. You don't see it that way?
I don't know. I don't fully buy it. I think something happened and you closed off and started.
I did. I'm saying that I was a true multiculturalist, and African American hip hop culture interested me, and I felt bad. I saw I wasn't a degenerate, and I could see like the jealousy of these people who get to fornicate with a bunch of women and party and sin, and also like feeling bad like that these people are largely excluded from. Even though I'm a nerd, I'm not popular, but like I'm still relatively, I'm on the inside. I'm intellectual. I went to the best schools. I'm connected in the political, economic, government world, even though like I don't get invited to parties and don't have close friends. And then, so I saw these people who are largely on the outside, but they're kind of cool. They're popular. And so some people I maybe had real friendships with, the saying that it was like a opposites attract type thing. And it was like legitimately interest where people in the party culture and me were just, it was an opposite attract type friendship. Let's explore the world together.
I understand that. Has there been any time where there has been a woman where you were feeling like there was a path to you getting married?
No, unfortunately not. Like I mean, saying I if I did have one kind of like girlfriend, and that was more out of convenience or wonderment, like in New York, but no, I mean, it wasn't like would have never worked into a marriage. And even here in Detroit, like I can't even think. I know a lot of women, like relatively, I know hundreds and thousands of Jewish women. I know thousands of women, but like in terms that would be I'm so eccentric that like I've never even seen a woman that would be even close to being a match for me. I'm kind of almost.
Maybe that's just something you believe about yourself, but isn't true, David.
Well, I could probably, God forbid, I could, I could find a woman, and like people that just get married and have kids, or find a marriage of convenience, or like success, or saying like, okay, if I prove myself by being successful in the material world, and I could find a woman through wealth and prominence. But not someone who really shared my interest or outlook in life. And then I think like I'd have kids and it'd just be a disaster. And so like, I don't want to be like Miayish and give up. Like I believe in God and believe there has to be the right woman out there for me. But like, I'm getting older and older, and I'm not really finding them. And I'm not even like, I'm out here on the web. Maybe now that there's like tens and tens of, hundreds of hours now of me on the web, like, a woman will be able to research, like, who is this guy? But like, no, unfortunately, I don't see anything in the prospects there. It's kind of, but I surrender to God, like Rebbe Nachman, never alone. And like, I believe, like the suffering has to be worth it. And, hopefully this right woman's eventually going to meet her, and, it will be a fit, and I will be able to build up in a family, a Jewish family, and raise my kids Hasidic, even though, like a Hasidic Hare Krishna and all my eccentricities. But I'm not even close to finding it, unfortunately. I don't even know the venues to seek for it. That's why I'm out here on the web. Saying like,
wait, so you're out here streaming to meet the love of your life?
Well, I mean, no, I'm out here to share my ideas and share my research and find but yeah, I think that it might help me also to find my love, because people don't really know who I am. So I'm saying I might be able to be, so to say, marriage material, dating material on the market through wealth or prominence. Saying like, oh, you should date this guy Duvid because he's going to be able to make a lot of money, take care of you, or he's like prominent in the community, knows a lot of powerful, wealthy people, or something like that. But like instead, like like this guy's really a good match for you. Like, nah, I never heard anyone think like that. To say, like this woman's a good match for you.
I don't know, dude. I think your dialogue with your version of God seems very, very deep. But there's like
if I gotta find myself, like how can I find the right woman if I don't find myself? And it's like, God forbid, I'm never going to find myself. Like,
I think
I'm never going to find the right woman versus other people, like Brundle or something. It's like, okay, like, they were degenerate, they dated, they had relations, and they got married, and they just make the best of it, which is probably how most people did. It's probably how my parents did it. They were just dated when they're young, and then they got married and had kids already, and then they just stuck with it. And even though relatively, was it the greatest match? They had very divergent interests, but they just made the best of it and made it work.
I think you believe somewhere inside of you that, it just sounds like what you're saying is like, I'm not ready yet. I don't deserve it because I haven't found myself fully yet. And I think that's kind of a cop-out, David. I think you could totally...
No, I think I'm pretty ready, and like I'm not sure like deserve or not. I just I got to find the right woman. I haven't found her. And I'm not even saying like I'm necessarily that picky or something like that. I need a beautiful woman or a wealthy woman. Like I definitely need an intelligent woman.
Would you, if a woman came along and she felt right for you, and this is my last question before I have to go to sleep because I have to be up at 7 a.m. And it's 1:10 here. If you were to find someone who felt like the perfect woman in every way except she was not Hasidic. Oh, well, this is going to be a two-part question.
We're saying she wasn't Jewish? You're going to add like she wasn't
No. Well, Jew. Sure, that might fall into it. But if let's say a Jewish woman.
I'm going to end up marrying some Indian girl one day. Like you're saying, like I can't find the right Jewish girl. So I found all the qualities I wanted in a woman. Except she's Hindu, she's not Jewish.
No, or she's not Hasidic.
Well, she wasn't Hasidic. That's not a big deal. At least she's Jewish. But it's saying like if she wasn't, but I'm saying now that like I haven't found. It was like a Hindu girl or something like that, and it's saying like like everything I'm looking for, except she's a Hindu. She's not Jewish, and like then like I don't know what would I do. I'm gonna marry a Hindu girl. And like I'm gonna have like these like half Jewish kids that aren't Jewish halakhically, and my wife isn't gonna mind that I'm Hasidic and she's Hindu, and it's going to just be like a disaster.
Well, maybe it would be a disaster, but if you found that person, would you do it?
I probably would. I'm saying, yeah. I mean, she wasn't Hasidic, and she was Jewish, and was willing to let me live a Hasidic lifestyle, or even consider raising the kids and at least to be aware of that lifestyle. Yeah, at this point, like like I'd probably do it to say like, yeah, I'm not going to find a Hasidic girl, especially like most Hasidic girls aren't educated. So like,
right.
like Leibniz in the best of all possible worlds. Like I'm saying the best of all possible worlds probably.
So yeah, finding an educated Hasidic woman is that is difficult. You're right. That's sad.
So finding like a secular Jewish girl who has divergent interest, who is interested in Hinduism and Hasidus and science or something like that, and
right,
be willing to experiment in raising the kids Hasidic, is that's something like, yeah, I could see something like that.
Well, dude, you need the woman to be interested in science and all the stuff you're interested in.
No, I mean she has to be interested probably in just Hasidus and vegetarian. And willing to, at least willing to let me continue in these pursuits and raise the kids in kind of like this quasi like Hindu Jewish scientist, Hasidic scientist type thing, and be compatible enough. Like and so she was just Jewish and willing to experiment and raise the kids that way, and like love and support me. That might be enough. So just the woman was intelligent enough to be interesting to me and attractive enough to for me to be able to produce children with, and support me in my endeavors. That would probably be enough, saying in whether she wasn't Hasidic or not, or even if she was a secular Jew, I might be able to make that work, even if she was a secular Jew, and give me Jewish children, and be willing to experiment with like raising the kids like somewhat quasi-Hasidic, or at least not minding me be Hasidic.
Now, what
if it was like a secular Jewish woman who like could picture in her own mind marrying a Hasidic man, even though she's secular?
Okay, what if this woman?
Which my grandmother was like that. I'm saying my grandmother's father was Orthodox, and my great grandmother was secular, but the marriage worked. They stayed together. He put on tefillin and kept the Orthodox customs his whole life, and they had kids and raised a family. And his wife was secular, and they raised secular kids. I mean, yeah, I could see that possibly. Yeah, I mean, that could possibly work if I found a secular Jewish woman who didn't mind her husband being Hasidic.
Okay, well,
that might be more likely than finding a Hasidic woman that didn't mind her husband being involved in like Hinduism or intellectual or pursuing like all these different pursuits. That might be more. It might be more likely for me to find a secular Jewish woman who just doesn't mind my eccentricities than to find a Hasidic woman who would put up with me.
Sure. Well, and David, what about? This is the final part of the question and the last thing before I have to go to bed. What if like all your streaming and finding this audience in the alt-right and cultivating essentially this audience of largely anti-Semites watching you and saying, you know what, we like you, David. What if a woman were to be in that who reached out was like, you know what, I think we can see past our differences. I'm alt-right and I'm diehard Kevin McDonald. I'm going to vote for Patrick Little, but
she's not Jewish, and she doesn't mind marrying a Hasidic guy, even though she's not Jewish, or thinks she's thinking like, David, like if I could just get you to shave and cut off your payas and get a job and make a bunch of money, you'd be all right.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying someone on the alt-right who is largely anti-Semitic, except when it comes to you for whatever reason.
I mean, but she's Jewish. She's got like her mother's Jewish.
No, she's not Jewish.
Yeah,
no, like let's just say like purely hypothetical here.
But and saying like she's gonna let me walk around with a yarmulke and payas.
Yep, she loves it.
I mean, I don't know. I'm saying like, I mean, possibly, but yeah, I doubt it. And it's saying like, then like, what about the kids? I'm gonna have like these half Jewish, halakhically non-Jewish kids. I'm gonna try to raise them. It'd just be a disaster. So like, she'd have to actually be Jewish. She'd be like 1/8 Jewish. Like if she was like 1/8 Jewish or something from her mother's mother, or something, like maybe it'd work, or it's like something like that. But she'd have to be like at least half a quarter Jewish, and she'd have to be Jewish probably from like her mother's mother.
Okay.
Then I could see it working, saying like like it just happens to be like my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor and she didn't really like telling anybody about it, and like so halakhically I'm Jewish, but like most of my friends don't even know I'm Jewish. Like yeah, I could conceivably saying like, I don't mind if my kids are like kind of Hasidic, that kind of interests me. I want to know my heritage, but it's like what's that famous like Tara McCarthy or something like that? Like like it turned out that she's like halakhically, I mean, I don't know her. I mean, just like a name or something like, or like Lauren Rose. Like it turns out Lauren Rose, her mother's Jewish.
Is that true?
No, I just made that up. But I'm saying if you're saying something like that, and it's like like David, like you didn't know that like Lauren Rose is actually halakhically Jewish. Her mother's a Jew.
That's okay. Well,
I mean, that would be conceivable, and saying like God works in mysterious ways, and like I submit and surrender to God. And part of me putting out the YouTube page, it does have that hidden intention in it. Although it's mostly an intellectual endeavor, because like it's not like Luke Ford or something where that's mostly what he talks about, or he gives platform to that. Like I'm mostly an ideas person.
Okay. Well, David, as always, it's been very nice chat.
I know you got a big day tomorrow, so thanks for coming on. Have a great night.
All right, you too, David. Take care.
Okay. I guess I'll close up the stream unless someone's got something to say. 16 people here. Ashamed to leave you all hanging. So link in the chat. Otherwise, I'm gonna close it off and call it a good night. I'm pretty happy with the stream tonight. I got the content out there. I'm not sure if I'm going to speak to JF on Tuesday, and if I do and we continue these topics, this will be good debate prep. And for people who are enjoying the content, like this is a lifetime of research. I've been researching this my whole adult life, and I put hours and hours, tens of hours into research into this, and hope whatever persuasion or people have, this was interesting. And like my roommate was saying that this is largely Western. So I know a lot of the people in these circles, they're not so interested in the Jewish stuff. So but you may not be as intellectual as me or have the time to do so much research. So almost everything I said tonight was from the greatest of the Western tradition. So have a great night. I guess I'm going to sign off, and I'll try to add table of contents to this tomorrow. So if people watch this, they'll be able to flip directly to the parts that are more interesting. Shalom. God bless. Thanks everyone for watching. Trouble signing off here. Bye-bye.